A 19-year-old sat across from detectives in Dallas County and, according to the arrest affidavit in his case, told them he panicked. Not that he hurt anyone. Not that he saw a crime happen. He said that he and Daniel Erving jumped off a railroad bridge into Lake Ray Hubbard together, that Erving surfaced once, called out for help, and then went under and didn't come back up, and that after climbing out of the water himself, he didn't call 911. He and the friend he was with threw Erving's clothes into the tree line, got in Roper's own car, and drove off, throwing Erving's own cell phone into a ditch along the way. Then, back on his own phone, Roper deleted every text message he and Erving had ever sent each other because, in his own words to investigators, he knew there would be an investigation and he didn't want to get into trouble. Erving's body wasn't found that day. It took 4 more days, until April 17th, for anyone to recover it. That's not a confession to a killing. It's a confession to something else entirely, and by the end of this you're going to understand exactly why that difference matters, in 3 separate cases, in 3 separate states, involving 3 teenagers who all died within a few months of each other, 2 of them on the exact same day. If you've been anywhere near this corner of the internet the last few weeks, you already have a version of this story sitting in your head. Maybe it's the clip of Brandon Tatum interviewing Nolan Wells' friend. Maybe it's Ben Crump at a podium in Nashville, flanked by 3 grieving families. Maybe it's just the shorthand that keeps getting recycled. 3 black teenagers, 3 mysterious deaths, 1 summer. I'm not here to hand you that video again. I want to walk you through what's actually written on the charging documents, what's genuinely still unresolved in each case, and what a family's own attorney is doing procedurally right now before anyone has been charged with causing any of these 3 deaths. And I want to be upfront about something as we go. Some of what follows is fact, pulled directly from arrest affidavits, autopsy reports, and on-the-record statements. Some of it is analysis, me putting 2 confirmed facts next to each other and asking what the gap between them means. I'll try to keep those 2 things clearly separated as we go, because blurring them is exactly how a real, unresolved case turns into a rumor nobody can walk back. Here's the thing: the headlines keep collapsing into one story that isn't actually one story. In Texas, in Kentucky, and in Mississippi, 3 18-year-olds died, 2 of them on July 4th itself, the 3rd weeks earlier in April. And in at least 2 of the 3 cases, the people who were physically present when it happened are now facing felony charges. Not for murder. For what they did with the evidence in the minutes and hours after. That's a different legal animal. It requires prosecutors to prove an entirely different set of facts. And if you've been watching this and coming away thinking police are sitting on 3 unsolved murders, I need you to sit with the actual paperwork for a minute, because the truth underneath it is stranger, and in some ways more damning, than the version making the rounds. Let's ground this properly, because there's less agreement on the basics than a few days of headlines suggest. Daniel Erving was 18, a senior at Satchsa High School, an honor roll student, a member of the swim team, and on April 13th he'd been picked up from home with a simple, ordinary reason given for the trip: to go fishing. He never came back from it. Instead, he ended up at a railroad bridge over Lake Ray Hubbard near the 6300 block of Miller Road, about 15 miles east of downtown Dallas, where he, the only black teenager in the group, and 2 white friends all jumped into the water together. Erving surfaced once, called for help, and went under. The other 2 came back up. He never did. I mentioned the racial makeup of that group plainly once here at the start because it's part of why this case attracted a civil rights attorney in the first place, and I'd rather name it directly than let it sit as subtext for the rest of the hour. Nolan Wells was also 18, a student athlete from Ocean Springs, Mississippi, and on the 4th of July he went out on a boat with a group of friends to Horn Island, a barrier island off the Mississippi coast that on any given holiday weekend is packed, by one witness's own account, thousands of people, boats stretching for miles. When that group came back to the mainland that night, Nolan wasn't with them. A National Park Service ranger found his body at the island's northwestern tip on the morning of July 6th. Tyler Smith, 18, a recent graduate of Lafayette High School in Lexington, Kentucky, suffered a gunshot wound to the head and face at a home on Bluebonnet Drive sometime between roughly 2:26 and 3:30 in the morning on July 4th, at a gathering of about 6 young adults. Police were told the group had been playing Russian roulette and that Smith shot himself. He was rushed to University of Kentucky Hospital with life-threatening injuries and was pronounced dead there around 6 that morning, roughly 3 hours after the shooting itself. He didn't die instantly at the scene, which matters, because it means there was a window of hours, not minutes, during which the people around him already knew exactly how serious this was, while doctors were actively trying to save him. 3 deaths, 3 jurisdictions, 3 separate initial rulings of accident, and 3 families who, independently of each other, refused to accept those rulings and eventually ended up standing at the same podium in Nashville this July, next to the same attorney, telling 3 different versions of what might be the same underlying failure. That Nashville event was real and specific. A press conference on July 30th at the National Urban League's annual conference, where the league's own president and CEO, Mark Morial, put the organization's institutional weight behind all 3 families' demand for answers. Liza Park, a senior attorney on Crump's own team, put the moral case in a single sentence that day: "If there is a time in your life to do the right thing, this is it." And Crump himself summed up the through line in one blunt sentence: "No one has been held accountable in any way." We're going to get to the answers on what happened to Nolan Wells, Daniel Erving, and Tyler Smith, 3 18-year-old black boys. That's a rallying line, and it's meant to be one. It's also, notably, not quite accurate as a factual statement. 2 people have been arrested and charged in connection with 2 of these 3 cases, even if neither has been charged with causing a death. Holding both of those things in mind at once, the real momentum behind this movement and the places where its own rhetoric outruns the paperwork is exactly the discipline this entire hour is asking of you. I want to slow down here because the instinct, and I understand the instinct, is to treat "the families don't believe the accident" ruling as the same claim 3 times over. It isn't. What's actually alleged is different in each case. What evidence exists is different. And, critically, what's actually been charged so far is different. Flatten these into one story, and you lose the thing that makes this worth 40-plus minutes of your time. In 2 of the 3, real people have already been charged with a real crime, and it is a murder. It's tampering. Almost nobody explains what that charge requires prosecutors to prove, why it's often the only charge available even when everyone involved suspects something worse, or why, from a defense attorney's chair, a client would take that charge and be relieved it isn't something heavier. Before we go case by case, I want to name something about why stories like this one pull at people the way they do, because I think it explains a lot of what's gone wrong and how they've been covered elsewhere. Nobody sits with a case like Daniel Erving's or Tyler Smith's or Nolan Wells's because they enjoy grief. What actually pulls a person in is the gap, the space between what a family was told and what a family can prove, between a clean official sentence like "ruled accidental" and the messy, human, contradictory pile of facts sitting underneath it. That gap is where the mind goes to work because it's uncomfortable to leave it alone. We want resolution. A parent wants it more than anyone watching from a screen ever could, and that difference in stakes is worth remembering every time this story gets treated like entertainment instead of somebody's actual son. So if some of what follows makes you angry, or makes you want an answer faster than the evidence can honestly give you one, that reaction isn't wrong. It's just worth catching in yourself, because it's the same reaction that's already driven a lot of amateur speculation into these 3 cases, some of it kind, some of it genuinely cruel, almost none of it helpful to the families living inside the unresolved parts. So let's do this properly, case by case, starting with the one where the paper trail runs longest. Daniel Erving drowned on April 13th. For nearly 3 months, that's where the public record stopped. A swim team kid, a bridge jump, an accidental drowning, a body recovered 4 days after he went missing. Then on July 9th, investigators arrested 19-year-old Lucas Roper and a 17-year-old whose name hasn't been released because he's a juvenile, and charged both with tampering with physical evidence, a 3rd-degree felony in Texas. That anonymity isn't a special favor granted in this case specifically. Juvenile records are sealed as a matter of routine practice in Texas and most other states, which means that even as this story keeps growing, one of the 2 people who were actually there will likely remain legally unnamed for the rest of this case's public life, whatever a court eventually decides about what he did. According to the affidavit, once Erving went under, the 2 of them didn't call for help. They threw his clothes into the tree line above the water, and left in Roper's car. And here's a detail that tells you something about how shaky even the two suspects' own account of that night is. They don't agree with each other on who did what. Roper told investigators he ordered the younger suspect to get rid of Erving's phone. The 17-year-old told investigators it was Roper who personally threw away Erving's clothes. Two people, both admitting concealment happened, each pointing a finger at the other for the specifics, which tells you that even the version of events coming from inside the tampering charge itself isn't fully settled. What isn't in dispute is Roper's own phone. He told detectives directly that he deleted every text message he and Erving had ever exchanged because he knew an investigation was coming and didn't want to get into trouble. None of this had to come from an affidavit alone either. A business owner along Lake Ray Hubbard held onto surveillance footage from that afternoon and eventually handed police a flash drive of it. The video shows what you'd expect from an ordinary Sunday at a lake popular with local teenagers. Erving and the two other boys arriving, walking toward the railroad bridge that high schoolers in the area treat as a kind of rite of passage, the three of them together. Nothing unusual. Then, about an hour later, the same camera catches only two of them coming back, not walking, running, straight into a white vehicle and gone. They were coming fast, running, and they got in the white vehicle and they left, the business owner told a local station. He's also said, plainly, that watching it back left him disturbed. That footage doesn't prove intent, and it doesn't resolve what happened in the water. But it's the one piece of this entire story that isn't anyone's account of anything. It's just a camera, recording exactly what an outside observer would have seen that day, and what an outside observer saw was two boys running from a lake where they'd gone in with three. That detail about the bridge being a known rite of passage matters more than it might seem, and it's worth sitting with for a second. This wasn't three boys doing something unusual or reckless in a way that stood out. It was, by all accounts, an ordinary Sunday activity for teenagers in that specific area, the kind of thing that happens without incident most of the time, which is exactly why nobody standing nearby would have thought twice about it in the moment. That's part of what makes this case land differently than a story about obvious danger ignored. It was mundane right up until it wasn't, and the two boys who walked away from it made choices afterward that had nothing mundane about them at all. Now here's the detail that should stop you, because it barely made it into most of the coverage. Erving didn't just go under silently. The record states he surfaced once and called out for help before he went under for good. Somebody was close enough on that bridge, in the water with him, to hear him call out directly. And what happened in the minutes after that, by Roper's own account, wasn't a 911 call. It was two people leaving, on foot, and in Erving's own car, while, according to investigators, at least one of them began methodically erasing the digital record of ever knowing him. Erving's mother, Tamika Erving, put the contradiction better than I can paraphrase it. A reasonable-minded person would know, if you are not guilty of a crime, why would you throw away his clothes and delete messages and not even call his mother? That's not a rhetorical flourish from a grieving parent. It's the actual hole at the center of the official ruling. The family's attorney, Sean Derdia, has said much the same thing in blunter terms. For these two suspects to say he drowned and they left. It doesn't add up. Something smells off to us. When the tampering arrests finally came, Tamika's own reaction was careful in a way worth noting. She called it partial justice, two words that hold both relief and its limits in the same breath, an actual step forward, and, in the same sentence, an acknowledgement that it isn't the whole answer she's still waiting on. It's the kind of exact, careful phrase a person only reaches for after they've had real time to sit with disappointment and refuse to let it curdle into either false gratitude or total despair. Here's my own read on that gap, for what it's worth, and I want to flag clearly that this next part is interpretation, not a fact pulled from a document. A genuine panic reaction. Someone watching a friend drown, freezing, running, even failing to call for help out of shock, is a real, well-documented human failure. It's not admirable, but it's explicable. What's harder to explain as pure panic is the second stage. Not just fleeing the scene, but going on to methodically dispose of a dead friend's belongings and scrub a phone of a relationship's entire digital footprint. Panic is chaotic. What's described in this affidavit is closer to procedure. That doesn't prove Roper or the juvenile caused Erving's death. It genuinely doesn't. and the medical examiner's finding of accidental drowning with no current suspicions of foul play still stands as the official record. But it's worth naming plainly that the no foul play conclusion rests entirely on the account of the two people who, by their own admission, spent the aftermath disposing of evidence instead of calling for help or calling Erving's mother. When the only two witnesses to a death are also the only two people who tampered with the evidence of it, no suspicion of foul play is a much thinner finding than the phrase makes it sound. There's a gap in this timeline worth sitting with before we go further, because it undercuts any story where investigators simply didn't have enough to act. Roper was interviewed by police in late April, just 3 days after Erving's body was recovered. Whatever he told them then, it took until July 8th for an arrest warrant affidavit to get stamped and finalized, and July 9th for him to be arrested. That's roughly 2.5 months between police sitting Roper down and police doing anything about what he told them. Rowlett police, for their part, have repeatedly said the case belongs to Dallas police since Erving's death technically occurred within Dallas city limits, and that Rowlett is only assisting, a jurisdictional handoff that's procedurally accurate and still, for a family waiting on answers, cold comfort. One advocacy group representing the family put it more bluntly than I would on my own. This case represents a complete breakdown in urgency, accountability, and equal justice. A young black student goes missing, and instead of immediate action, his family is met with delay and dismissal. I'm not going to tell you whether that characterization is fair to the individual detectives who worked the case. I don't have visibility into their caseload or what else was competing for their time. But the raw fact of a 2.5-month gap between interview and arrest on a case this serious is real, and it's the kind of detail that explains a family's frustration far better than any accusation of bias could. It's also worth naming plainly that a jurisdictional handoff between two neighboring police departments is exactly the kind of ordinary bureaucratic friction that can slow a case down without anyone actually deciding, at any point, to let it slide. Cases genuinely do stall in the gap between whose desk is this on and who has time to work it, even in departments acting in good faith. That's not a defense of the 2.5-month gap. It's a reminder that institutional slowness and institutional indifference can look identical from the outside while coming from very different places. I want to be precise about what that tampering charge does and doesn't mean, because it would be easy to hear, Roper's been arrested, and assume the case is solved. It isn't, and it's worth knowing exactly how little arrested actually means in practice here. Roper posted a $10,000 bond within days and was released, which is standard for a third-degree felony with no prior record. Not a sign that anyone's treating this loosely, but a reminder that charged and in custody facing consequences are two very different stages of a case still barely out of its opening moves. Being charged with tampering does not mean Roper or the younger suspect caused Erving's drowning. Crump, representing the family, has said the tampering charge filed so far doesn't go far enough, and the Erving family is publicly asking Dallas County prosecutors to present the full case to a grand jury and pursue it as something closer to a homicide investigation, not a closed accidental death with a side charge attached. That's a request. It is not a finding. Nobody has been charged with causing Erving's death. What's been proven, to the legal standard required for an arrest, is that two people who were present chose concealment over disclosure once things turned fatal. And as of the most recent update, on July 31st, that first step has already moved forward on its own. A Dallas County grand jury formally indicted Roper on the tampering charge, specifically for tampering with or fabricating physical evidence with intent to impair, which means a grand jury has already looked at this much of the case and found enough to send it toward trial. That's real, meaningful movement. It is still not a homicide indictment, and prosecutors haven't said anything publicly about pursuing one, but it means the tampering piece of this is no longer sitting in limbo the way the Wells case's underlying questions still are. So here's the open question this case actually leaves you sitting with, and it's worth asking yourself before we move on, because it's going to come back in a slightly different shape twice more before we're done. If the only account of what happened on that bridge comes from the two people who fled, threw away his clothes and his phone, drove off, and can't even agree between themselves on who did which part, what would it actually take at this point for anyone to know for certain whether accident is even the right word to be using? There's a specific kind of grief buried in Tamika Erving's question that I don't think gets enough attention, because it's easy to read her words as anger alone, and I don't think that's actually what's underneath them. Why would you throw away his clothes and delete messages, and not even call his mother? Read that last part again slowly. Not call the police. Call his mother. Somewhere in the space of 3 months, Daniel Erving's mother had to live with the knowledge that in the last moments of her son's life, the people who were with him made a series of decisions, and every single one of those decisions was about protecting themselves rather than reaching her. That's a specific, private kind of pain, separate from the public fight over charges and grand juries. The pain of learning that in the actual moment it mattered most, you were the last call anyone thought to make, if they thought of you at all. His full name was Daniel Micaniah Lenerl Erving. And in her own words, away from the press conferences and the legal arguments, Tamika has described him simply as a young man in high school full of life, love, and potential, with a kind heart, a bright smile, and dreams that deserved the chance to be fulfilled. One of those dreams, specifically, was the military he wanted to enlist, a plan now permanently unrealized. I want to flag one thing precisely here. In raising funds for his funeral, Tamika has described Daniel's death as the result of a homicide, which is her own characterization as his mother, not the official finding. The medical examiner's ruling, as we covered, was accidental drowning, with the tampering charge running as a separate matter. I'm noting the distinction not to argue with a grieving mother's choice of words, but because keeping fact and belief clearly labeled is the whole discipline this piece keeps asking of you, and it has to apply here too, even when the person saying it has more right to her own conclusion than anyone else in the story. What she's actually asking for, in raising money for that funeral, is simple and almost unbearably plain: the dignified and loving homegoing he deserves, as a single mother who couldn't manage the cost of burying her own son alone. That's the whole ask, underneath every legal filing and every press conference. Not a verdict, just the ability to bury her child properly. Local advocacy groups were pushing on this case long before Roper was ever arrested, which is worth noting because it undercuts the idea that this only became urgent once Crump got involved. Back in late April, days after Daniel drowned, Dominique Alexander, who leads the Next Generation Action Network, was already publicly criticizing Rowlett Police for what he described as a failure to act with urgency, and his organization worked alongside a second group, Justice Seekers, pressing for transparency for nearly 3 months before any charge was filed. The family held their own press conference on July 13th at the Next Generation Action Network's headquarters in Dallas, and it's the family's attorney, Sean Derdia, who put the 4-day gap into the single sentence I keep coming back to. Those 2 suspects let Daniel Erving sit on the bottom of Lake Ray Hubbard for 4 days. They went to school. They lived their lives. Say that out loud, and actually picture it. While Daniel's body was still in that lake, unrecovered, the 2 people who knew exactly where he was and how he'd gotten there were going to class, eating lunch, existing normally for 4 full days, while his mother didn't know where her son was at all. Daniel's sister was at that same press conference, and she said something that cuts past the legal argument entirely. For something like this to happen to him, and for it to be no sense of urgency, is absolutely ridiculous. Right is right, and wrong is wrong. And when it's a life or death situation, you are to render aid. That's not a legal theory. That's a teenager's own sibling stating the most basic moral expectation there is, and pointing out that it wasn't met. That specific image, the people closest to a tragedy simply continuing their ordinary lives while a family waited in agony, isn't unique to Daniel's case either, and it's worth naming the echo rather than letting it pass unnoticed. Warren Hudson went to a fireworks party. Whoever was in that house on Bluebonnet Drive went back to sleep, or went home, while a gun that didn't match its own casing sat wherever it ended up. Ordinary life resuming almost immediately, right alongside an unresolved death, shows up in all 3 of these cases, and every time it does, it's one of the details a grieving parent finds hardest to reconcile. Not necessarily because it proves anything, but because grief doesn't pause for anyone else's convenience, and watching everyone else's world keep turning normally is its own specific, quiet cruelty, one none of these 3 mothers signed up for, and none of them can opt out of, no matter how the rest of their case eventually resolves. hold that same framework because it's about to look almost identical in Lexington, and then diverge sharply. Tyler Smith died the same night Nolan Wells went missing at a gathering on Bluebonnet Drive, sometime between roughly 2:26 and 3:30 in the morning. The account investigators were initially given was that a group of young men were playing Russian roulette, the gun went off, and Smith shot himself. Lexington police classified it as accidental and self-inflicted. For Smith's grandmother, Nacy Anderson, and his uncle, Trayvon Petty, that never sat right, and not because of a hunch, because of one specific, basic investigative step that never happened. Nobody tested Smith's hands for gunshot residue. If you followed any case where a self-inflicted ruling later got contested, you know why that omission is close to the whole ballgame. Residue testing is one of the more basic ways investigators corroborate or contradict an account of who actually fired a weapon and how. Skipping it doesn't prove foul play by itself. It means the ruling was built on the word of the people who were in the room that night, without physical confirmation one way or the other. I want to flag something about the specific explanation offered here, clearly marked as my own observation rather than an established fact. Russian roulette is not the default account anyone reaches for when a gun goes off at a party. It's a specific, almost cinematic claim, and it happens to be one that, if accepted at face value, explains a death without requiring anyone to identify who actually pulled the trigger on Tyler specifically. Everyone in the game shares the risk, which can make everyone in the room equally reluctant to point fingers and can make accidental feel like the natural conclusion, even without anyone lying outright. That's not an accusation that the account was invented. People genuinely do play that game. Recklessly, sometimes fatally. But it's worth noticing that the explanation offered happens to be the one that requires the least amount of anyone actually being held responsible for anything, and that's exactly the kind of detail a residue test could have either confirmed or complicated, which is precisely the test that never got run. Anderson kept pushing anyway. When she asked how investigators had concluded it was accidental, the answer, she says she got back, amounted to, because the other people at the party said so. She's not been quiet about how that landed. I felt cheated, she said. I felt that, like, once again, you are insulting my intelligence by simply offering me a carrot. Sit with that specific word for a second, a carrot. Not a bone, not a scrap, a carrot. The thing you dangle in front of someone to keep them moving in a direction you've already chosen for them, not something offered because it's actually nourishing. That's a precise, deliberate word from a woman who works in mental health for a living and chooses her language carefully, and it captures something the tampering charge against Chestnut genuinely is, whatever else it also is, a real step, and also the smallest possible step that could be offered without addressing the actual question she's asking. She said flatly, I absolutely do not believe it was a self-inflicted gunshot wound. When she pushes back on any implicit suggestion that Tyler might have hurt himself deliberately, she's doing it with a trained eye, not just a grandmother's instinct. There were no signs, she said, of any depression or crisis. Tyler's uncle, Trayvon Petty, has backed that up in his own words. I've never seen him upset. I've never seen my nephew mad. And there's a plainer version of the family's frustration too, one that doesn't need any interpretation at all. Petty has said, simply, I feel like we shouldn't have any questions. Had you done your job, we'd simply be able to prove it was self-inflicted. That's not a family demanding a particular conclusion. That's a family pointing out that a basic test, run properly, would have settled this either way, and it just wasn't run. There's one more detail worth sitting with here, and it's a small one. The family has said plainly that they don't know Bryce Chestnut. Not that they distrust him, not that they suspect him specifically, they simply don't know who he is, which raises its own quiet question about how someone unfamiliar to Tyler's own family ended up close enough to that gun to be the one facing tampering charges over it. It's a small gap in the story, but it's the kind of gap that tends to matter more than it looks like it should once a real investigation eventually fills it in. And in the moments when this case threatens to become just another statistic scrolling past on somebody's feed, Anderson is the one who said the thing that actually cuts through the noise. Tyler could have been your son, grandson, brother. Would you want them to go unspoken of, unviewed, undiscussed? I want you to know that Tyler mattered, that the world is different because he's no longer here. She's also drawn her own historical line, and I think it deserves to be heard in her words rather than mine. The first thing that came to mind for me was the story of Emmett Till and how disregarded his mother must have felt. His mother, Lindsay Smith, and his father, Titus Mayhorn, have carried that same fight since the week he died. His funeral was held July 10th at Consolidated Baptist Church, and a week after that, the family gathered quietly at a nearby park just to pray together. Not a press conference, not a camera, just people who loved Tyler quietly, sitting together with what they'd lost. What makes that loss even harder to accept is how specific his plans already were. Tyler had just graduated Lafayette High and had signed up to start at Bluegrass Community and Technical College, chasing a degree in robotics. Not a vague someday plan, an actual enrollment, a direction already chosen before any of this happened. Robotics, specifically, is worth sitting with for a second. It's a field built entirely on precision, on figuring out exactly why something did or didn't work the way it was supposed to. There's something almost unbearably fitting, and almost certainly coincidental, about a young man drawn to that kind of exacting, mechanical clarity dying in circumstances defined by the opposite of it. A story with no residue test, a gun that doesn't match, and a family left trying to reverse engineer a truth nobody handed them the parts for. Then the case turned on physical evidence, just not in the direction the initial account predicted. When officers arrived that night, several witnesses told them that 20-year-old Bryce Chestnut had been seen with a different gun than the one that ended up at the scene. When investigators sat him down, Chestnut told them his own account, that he'd handed his weapon to Smith, and that Smith had then, allegedly, used it on himself. But according to the citation against him, Chestnut also admitted he got scared afterward and took his own handgun away from the scene without ever telling officers he'd done it. So there's a version, by Chestnut's own words, where he handed Smith the gun. And then, separately, a preliminary examination of the firearm that actually was recovered found that it and the shell casing at the scene didn't match. Two different problems, sitting on top of each other. A man who admits removing a weapon from a death scene without disclosing it, and a recovered gun that the physical evidence says wasn't even the one fired. On July 10th, Lexington police charged Chestnut with tampering with physical evidence for it. Follow that sequence closely, because the order matters. Witnesses told police about the mismatched gun before investigators ever sat Chestnut down, which means his account of handing Smith the weapon came after officers already had reason to doubt whatever story was circulating at the scene, not before. That doesn't make his account false. It does mean he was explaining himself into a version of events investigators had already started to question, rather than volunteering the full picture unprompted. Think through, for a second, what that actually does to the original story. Accidental, self-inflicted, was a conclusion built on witness accounts corroborated by a specific piece of physical evidence, the recovered firearm. Once that piece of physical evidence turns out not to match the shell casing at the scene, the corroboration collapses, even if the underlying witness accounts don't change at all. That's an important distinction. Nobody has recanted their story about what happened that night. The story just lost its physical backup. And here's where I'll offer my own read again, clearly marked as such. A mismatched gun is one of the more specific, hard-to-explain-away pieces of evidence you can have in a case like this. People misremember timelines. People give inconsistent accounts under stress. A gun simply is or isn't the gun that fired a specific shell casing, and this one wasn't. That's not ambiguous the way a lot of the rest of this case is. Crump only joined Smith's case at the very end of July, announcing it the same day as the Nashville conference and putting it in the same breath as three of his most well-known past cases. Just like we got justice for George Floyd, just like we got justice for Breonna Taylor, just like we got justice for Ahmaud Arbery, we're gonna get justice for Tyler Smith. He said his own investigators are already digging in. What happened to Tyler Smith, it shocks my conscience, he said, adding that his team is starting from the position that the official account can't be true. Nacy Anderson's own ask, when she's stripped away the rhetoric, has stayed remarkably modest throughout. I want transparency. I want you to simply do the job you are paid to do. As of this recording, Lexington police have said there's no update in the case. This makes Smith's case the newest and thinnest thread of the three in terms of public reporting, and I want to be honest about that rather than smooth it over the way a lot of coverage has. What's solid? The residue test that was never run, the gun that failed to match its own casing, and the tampering charge against Chestnut. What's still not publicly resolved: who fired the shot and where the actual weapon is, if Chestnut's alleged tampering involved swapping it out for a different gun entirely. Nacy Anderson doesn't have that answer yet. Nobody outside that house on Bluebonnet Drive does, at least not on the public record. And in fairness, the same silence surrounding Roper applies to Chestnut too. No public statement, no interview, no version of his own account beyond what's already recorded in the citation against him. Two young men at the center of two of these three cases, both choosing not to speak publicly, both left in this video only through the words investigators wrote down about what they said in the room, not in their own voice, to you, directly. That absence is worth sitting with as its own kind of fact. It's Tyler's grandmother carrying most of this fight publicly, not his parents, and I think that's worth sitting with instead of just noting in passing. In families like this one, it's often the grandmother who ends up as the one standing in front of a camera because grief can be so total for a parent that somebody else has to be the one who's still functional enough to make calls, chase down a residue test that never happened, learn what a shell casing mismatch even means. Nacy Anderson didn't ask for that job. Nobody hands a grandmother a manual for becoming her grandson's advocate 3 weeks after burying him. She built it herself, out of persistence and out of refusing to let the other kids at the party said so be the final word on her grandson's life. That she happened to have a mental health background at all is almost incidental to the fight itself. She have made the same calls, asked the same questions, refused the same easy answer regardless of her profession. The credentials just happen to make it harder for anyone to dismiss her as simply an emotional grandmother rather than someone capable of reading a situation clearly. It's worth knowing, too, how the family actually found out Tyler was gone. Not a call from police, not a knock from a chaplain, but a concerned neighbor who drove over to his grandparents' house in person to tell them because word had already started moving through the neighborhood faster than any official notification did. The community around that same neighborhood later held its own prayer vigil under the plain, gentle banner of bringing love and joy back to a block that had just watched something terrible happen on it, and a GoFundMe set up for Lindsay Smith to help with funeral costs had raised $18,000 of its $20,000 goal within a week from people who'd never met Tyler at all. The kind of quiet, unglamorous grief response that never makes it into a headline the way a lawsuit or a press conference does. If you're the kind of viewer who's already turning any of this into a private theory of your own, notice that instinct for a second, because it's exactly the instinct that's already done real, documented damage in the third case, and we're getting there now. Nolan Wells is the one where I need you to hold two things at once that feel like they should contradict each other, and don't. This is simultaneously the most publicly volatile of the three cases, and for a long stretch of it, the one with the least solid forensic ground under it, though as you're about to see, that's shifted more recently than most coverage has caught up with. Before any of that, it's worth knowing who he actually was, because it's easy for a case this loud to flatten a person into a headline. Nolan Xavier Wells played wide receiver at Southwest Mississippi Community College, majoring in general business while he balanced the sport. His father has described him, plainly, as a silent leader, not a big talker, more action than words, the kind of teammate other players looked to without him ever needing to ask for it. Coaches and friends have echoed that same picture. Kind, hardworking, somebody who could make friends with anyone he met and who brought good energy into whatever room or huddle he walked into. He was one of 6 kids. His parents raised 5 other children alongside him, and by his family's account, he took the older brother role seriously, especially with one particular younger brother he bonded with over football specifically, the two of them sharing the sport the way some siblings share nothing at all. His high school football coach, Jake Bramlett, put it simply: his character spoke louder than his accomplishments, and he was loved deeply by his teammates and coaches. His principal, Dr. Jacob Dykes, called him an extremely kind and hard-working young man who left a lasting impression. And back on National Signing Day, in February of 2025, when Nolan committed to keep playing football at Southwest Mississippi Community College, he described it in his own words as truly a blessing to get to share that next step with his teammates, the kind of ordinary, hopeful, forward-looking sentence an 18-year-old says without any idea it'll later get quoted in a story about his death. That's the person underneath the timeline we're about to walk through minute by minute, not a case file. A young man, his teammates, his coaches, and 5 siblings are still, right now, actively mourning as a leader they lost. Hold that picture specifically against the version of him that circulated later, from witnesses describing heavy drinking that afternoon, because those two things aren't actually in conflict the way online arguments have treated them. A quiet, steady team leader can also have a few drinks at a 4th of July party on a crowded island. Both can be true at once, and neither one tells you anything about what happened to him in the water. Let's actually walk the clock on July 4th, because once you see it laid out minute by minute, the shape of what's unresolved gets much clearer than any single quote from either side. At 9:56 in the morning, a boat left a private dock in Ocean Springs carrying Nolan and a group of friends. It arrived at Horn Island at 11:14. Around 3 that afternoon, Nolan was last seen near the island. And this is the exact point where the accounts start to diverge, because what happened next depends entirely on whose version you're listening to. Around 4, someone on a boat that was taking on water called Sea Tow, the private towing company, reporting a failed bilge pump, the exchange we mentioned earlier. Our bilge pump stopped working, we're sinking, can y'all please come? With roughly 7 people reported on board. At 4:31, the damaged boat left Horn Island after getting assistance from a 21-year-old boat owner. At 5:52 it entered Fort Bayou. At 6:06 it was back at the dock. Then, at 7:19 that evening, the boat launched again and was transported to the owner's home in Biloxi. It wasn't until around 11 that night, nearly 7 hours after that boat first left the island, that a friend contacted the Coast Guard. At 11:07, Warren Hudson called Nolan's mother, Christine Wansley. At 11:49, she reported him missing. Sit with that gap for a second, because it's the actual crux of the entire Wells case, more than the autopsy, more than the online shouting match. A boat carrying Nolan's friends left Horn Island at 4:31 in the afternoon. Nobody called anyone about Nolan being missing until roughly 11 that night. That's not a 5-minute lapse in judgment. That's most of a day. Now here's where I owe you the other side of it, because it isn't as simple as they abandoned him and said nothing. Warren Hudson, in his own interview with Brandon Tatum, has given a specific, detailed account that Horn Island on July 4th was packed, thousands of people, boats for miles, and that Nolan appeared completely fine, drinking with a larger group earlier that day. Hudson says Nolan was repeatedly asked to get on their boat before they left, and that he chose to stay behind with a girl he'd been with. Someone Hudson says can also confirm that account. Hudson describes the actual departure as chaotic, driven by the sinking boat emergency. But here's the part of his own account that complicates the picture more than any outside criticism has. After docking, Hudson and a friend went to that friend's house to eat and rest, and then, later that same afternoon, went to a completely different 4th of July gathering, a party at a girl's house, with fireworks, swimming, people hanging out. By Hudson's own telling, it wasn't until sometime during that second party that a friend named Wyatt happened to bring Nolan's name up at all, and Hudson realized nobody there had heard from him. That's when he got a phone number from another friend, Javon, and called Nolan's mother around 11, matching the documented timeline. Sit with the shape of that. On his own telling, the group didn't spend the evening searching or worrying. They went to a party. Somebody had to say Nolan's name out loud before anyone noticed the silence. Hudson has since said, defending the choice not to sound the alarm sooner, "I'd rather call the Coast Guard 100 times and have my buddy be okay than call too early," which is a genuinely reasonable instinct in isolation and doesn't erase the fact that, on his own account, 7 or 8 hours passed at a lake party before anyone thought to check. There's a coda to that timeline too, worth including because it explains rather than excuses the gap. Even after a friend's agitated phone call around 12:30 that morning brought roughly 10 people to Hudson's house to start searching, Hudson himself has said he still wasn't alarmed at first. He said he and another friend assumed Nolan had simply crashed on someone's couch, reasoning that because Nolan had been drinking, he was probably just sleeping it off somewhere on a crowded island. Whether that assumption was reasonable in the moment or not, it's a real, specific account of why the people closest to Nolan didn't treat his absence as an emergency until considerably later than the actual danger warranted. There's a version of this that isn't about malice at all, Worth naming plainly even as we hold the timeline to account. 18-year-olds at a holiday party, some of them drinking themselves, aren't always equipped to recognize the difference between a friend who's fine and sleeping it off somewhere and a friend who's actually in danger, especially on an island packed with thousands of strangers where he's probably with someone else, is a genuinely plausible explanation for hours a day. Stretch. That doesn't make the gap disappear. It just means the most likely explanation for it, on the evidence available right now, is ordinary human misjudgment under confusing circumstances, not indifference to a friend's life. Here's my own analytical flag on Hudson's account, and I want to be careful with this one because it isn't proof of anything. It's a small inconsistency, not a verdict. In his own retelling, Hudson has said he personally last saw Nolan around 3 that afternoon, but has also said he talked to somebody personally who claims to have seen Nolan on the island as late as 6. Those two claims aren't necessarily contradictory. Different people can see the same person at different times over an afternoon on a crowded island, but it does mean Hudson's own account contains a 3-hour gap he's filling with secondhand information rather than something he witnessed directly. And separately, outlets citing sources with direct knowledge of the investigation have reported that at least 2 witnesses interviewed by law enforcement say they saw Nolan on Horn Island after the boat carrying his friends had already headed back to the mainland. I want to flag the sourcing on that one specifically because it's not an official statement from investigators or the family. It's unnamed sources through a tabloid outlet, which means it deserves to be held more loosely than anything pulled directly from an affidavit or a coroner's statement. But if it holds up, it would mean that he chose to stay with the group he was with account and then nobody knew where he was for 7 hours. Timeline aren't actually in conflict at all. They might just be 2 true things sitting side by side, which somehow makes the situation sadder rather than more sinister. A boy alone on an island as thousands of other people packed up and left it for the night, with nobody circling back to check. That's the honest, unresolved shape of it. An account from Nolan's friend that isn't unreasonable on its face, sitting next to a 7-hour documented gap between boat leaves and anyone calls for help, sitting next to a family that has said, in plain terms, that the choice to stay behind story doesn't match who their son was. Elmore Wansley, Nolan's father, has been direct about that. No, he wouldn't. Nolan always stays with the group. Asked if he believes his son was left behind, he didn't hedge. Yes. I don't believe he decided to stay on the island by himself. It just doesn't. That's not his character. On Good Morning America on July 10th, he put the same idea in 5 words that a lot of Black parents watching recognized instantly. If you go with a group, you stay with a group. Christine, on that same broadcast, kept her own ask about as simple and modest as a request can get. We just want honesty and transparency. We want a thorough investigation. We want that same respect that would be given to anybody else. And that's it. We just want answers. And there's one more detail his mother has pointed to that deserves more attention than it's gotten, because it's small, specific, and genuinely strange rather than emotionally charged. When friends retrieved Nolan's phone, there was no Snapchat content on it from that day. Christine Wansley has said plainly that doesn't track with how teenagers actually document a day like that. I know when kids get together for events like that, they snapping. And Snapchat content that would normally auto-delete after 24 hours means there's now no way to independently verify what was ever there in the first place. I'll be straightforward about why that detail catches my attention specifically. It's the one piece of this entire case that echoes, almost exactly, what's already confirmed and charged in Daniel Erving's case 3 states away, a phone with a missing digital record from the exact window that matters most. In Erving's case, that pattern got Lucas Roper arrested. In Wells's case, as of this recording, it's an observation from a grieving mother that nobody has yet turned into a charge, one way or the other. Though, as of the most recent update, Crump's team and the district attorney's office are reportedly coordinating on a joint inspection of that phone, potentially with the FBI involved directly, which at least suggests both sides finally agree it's worth a formal, shared look rather than dueling private theories. Warren Hudson has directly denied the implication attached to that missing content, saying plainly, "We had no reason to delete anything. There's nothing to hide here. We had no reason to delete anything, and we never did." He said he doesn't even know Nolan's phone password and never personally touched the device, that it was simply handed over to a family friend without incident. I want that denial represented here with the same weight as the suspicion around it. Christine's observation is real and unresolved, and so is Hudson's flat denial of any role in it, and right now neither one cancels the other out. There's something particularly cruel about the specific word undetermined that I don't think lands the same way until you imagine actually living inside it. A homicide ruling, however devastating, gives a family a direction to point their grief. An accident ruling, even one they reject, at least gives them a version of events to argue against. Undetermined gives a parent nothing to hold. It's not a door closing and it's not a door staying open. It's a door that was never fully built in the first place, because the body didn't survive long enough in a preservable state for anyone to build it properly. Christine Wansley has to live inside that unfinished room every day this case remains open, going to work at a job now flooded with strangers, leaving her one-star reviews, coming home to hate mail, without even the grim mercy of a settled fact to stand on. You might have already seen the version of this where the story stops at his friends left him to drown and won't talk. Here's what that framing skips entirely, and it's the newest, strangest piece of the whole case, so stay with me. On July 30th, the family's attorney announced they've now hired audio engineers to formally review that sea tow distress call, the recording released by Mississippi's Department of Marine Resources. On the tape, a caller tells the dispatcher, "Our bilge pump stopped working. We're sinking. Can y'all please come?" adding that everyone on board was unhurt and that nobody on the boat was over 21. The towing company's captain says a relative of the boat's owner later called back to say everyone on board had solved the problem and didn't need help. That's the entire recorded exchange. It's now under formal audio review because nobody has publicly confirmed whose voice is actually on that tape, what solved the problem meant in the moment, or how a boat that radioed "we're sinking" ends up, hours later, having gone from the island to Fort Bayou to the dock to Biloxi, one passenger short, with no further distress call ever made in between. And here's exactly the danger I was describing a minute ago, playing out in real time on this specific piece of audio. Before Crump's own experts had even weighed in, TMZ published what it called an enhanced version of that same call, claiming you could make out phrases like, "Is he dead? Check his chest. Wake up." Even Nolan's name spoken directly. It went everywhere. Then a digital forensics expert named Robert Fried, of the firm Page One Incorporated, who had nothing to do with either side of this fight, actually examined both versions side by side and found that TMZ's enhanced file ran 20 seconds longer than the original and carried an entirely different digital fingerprint. The kind of discrepancy that raises real questions about whether it had been altered rather than simply cleaned up. Fried's own transcription couldn't corroborate a single one of the dramatic phrases TMZ claimed to hear, distortion and all. He made a point on the record that's worth remembering for the rest of this video and honestly for the rest of your life as someone who watches true crime content. Once you're told a specific phrase is buried in an ambiguous recording, it becomes very easy to start hearing it whether or not it's actually there. That's not a knock on anyone's hearing. It's just how perception works under suggestion. The same basic mechanism behind hearing words in white noise when someone tells you what to listen for, applied here to a recording tied to a real teenager's death instead of a party trick. Edmiston's own attorney has gone further and called the TMZ version outright doctored. I'm not in a position to settle that dispute for you. What I can tell you is that the one piece of evidence that briefly convinced a huge number of people something sinister happened on that boat has already, within days, run into a credentialed expert who couldn't verify a word of it. Fried himself, an actual professional whose job is to listen to distorted audio for a living, admitted on the record that once he'd heard TMZ's claimed transcript, his own perception started drifting toward hearing those same words too, which is either the single most honest thing anyone in this case has said publicly, or the most quietly alarming, depending on how you look at it. Latino, defending his client on the same broadcast, put the whole ecosystem in one sentence I haven't been able to shake since I read it. People online think it's fun to play Clue with other people's lives. That's this entire case in 8 words, and it's worth remembering it applies to every name you've heard in this video, not just the ones you've already decided to root against. There's one more claim worth addressing directly, because it's the one that echoes loudest in every comment section under every video about this case, and it deserves the same fact-first treatment as everything else here rather than either repeating it uncritically or dismissing it out of hand. A preliminary document from Mississippi's Department of Marine Resources, obtained by ABC News, includes witness statements describing Nolan as drinking heavily that day. That's a real, sourced claim from an official document, not internet gossip. I want to be clear about that because plenty of the facts floating around this case aren't sourced nearly that solidly. But notice what it does and doesn't tell you. It doesn't tell you whether he drowned, whether anyone was with him when he went into the water, or why a boat radioed a sinking emergency and never followed up. Drinking heavily at a 4th of July party on a crowded island is, unfortunately, an extremely ordinary fact about an extremely large number of 18-year-olds that weekend, Nolan included by this account. It explains nothing about the 7-hour gap, the missing Snapchat data, or the title question. Treating it as though it resolves any of that is exactly the same mistake as treating a garbled recording as a confession, reaching for a fact that feels explanatory because the real explanation still isn't available. At that same July 30th update, Crump raised a second question that's arguably even harder to explain away, and it's one built on basic physics rather than any disputed witness account. His team is now working with oceanic engineering experts to examine how Nolan's body ended up recovered at essentially the same spot on Horn Island's northwestern tip, where he was last seen 2 days earlier. Barrier islands like Horn Island sit in moving water. Tides go out, tides come back in, currents shift a body that's been in the water for any length of time. Crump's question, in his own words, they say they found Nolan's body at the same location they left him at. We want to know how that is possible with the oceanic tides. He's put it even more bluntly elsewhere. It's not adding up. So we're going to dot every I and cross every T until we find out what happened to Nolan Wells. I don't have an oceanographer's answer to that, and neither, publicly, does anyone else yet, which is exactly why it's an expert question and not a talking point. But it's a real, specific, checkable claim, resting on tide charts and current data rather than anyone's account of that afternoon, and it's the kind of detail that either gets a clean scientific explanation soon, or becomes one more piece of this case nobody can quite make add up. I'll also say plainly that there are genuinely ordinary explanations oceanic engineers might land on that wouldn't need anyone to have done anything wrong at all. Barrier island geography, wind direction, and where a body first enters the water relative to a shoreline can all anchor it closer to shore than open water drift patterns might suggest to someone without that specific expertise. Raising the question is legitimate. Assuming the most sinister possible answer before the experts actually weigh in is exactly the shortcut this video keeps asking you not to take. Underneath all of this, the official investigation has been moving in its own, separate, much slower channel, and it's worth walking through that too, because it's the part almost nobody covers with any patience. The search itself, in the roughly 36 hours between Christine's 11:49 p.m. missing persons report and the discovery of Nolan's body, was not small. Mississippi's Department of Marine Resources launched a search vessel at Horn Island's northwestern tip by 8 the next morning, while Nolan's own father and his football coach conducted a private boat search of their own alongside it. Drone operations that morning failed repeatedly due to technical problems. By early afternoon, the Coast Guard had a helicopter in the air, and Jackson County had issued a formal missing persons bulletin. By evening, sonar surveys had come up inconclusive, and bad weather forced operations to pause for the night. The volunteer search and rescue group United Cajun Navy launched its own aircraft at 6 the following morning, and it was a National Park Service ranger, not any of those larger operations, who ultimately found Nolan at the same northwestern tip of the island where the search had started, at 8:45 that morning. That's a real, coordinated, multi-agency effort, not a case anyone simply ignored for 2 days, which matters for everything that follows, since a lot of the online narrative treats the search itself as part of the alleged indifference, when the documented record shows something closer to a genuine, if ultimately too late, mobilization. After the body was found on the morning of July 6th, it was transported to the Pascagoula coroner's office. The following day, Coroner Bruce Lind confirmed Nolan's identity through dental records, and the official autopsy was conducted that same afternoon at the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's office, before the family had even retained Ben Crump, which they did later that same day. On the very day the body was found, Ledbetter had already told reporters that detectives were interviewing people with first-hand interactions with Nolan on the day he went missing, and that no foul play has been identified at this time. A notably careful phrase, not there was no foul play, but that none had been identified yet, which is a real and meaningful difference. Most headlines flattened into a flat denial. By July 15th, Ledbetter confirmed the FBI had been assisting with a forensic examination of digital evidence since early in the investigation, and told reporters plainly, "We have interviewed approximately 60 witnesses, with the deepest of those interviews reserved for the 3 friends who'd actually been on the boat with Nolan that day." 60 witnesses is not a number you get from a case investigators are treating casually, whatever the online narrative about official indifference suggests. The independent autopsy itself was actually performed earlier than most people realize, on July 10th, just days after the body was found, even though the findings weren't announced publicly until July 22nd at the NAACP's National Convention in Chicago. It was quietly funded. It later emerged by former NFL quarterback Colin Kaepernick through his Know Your Rights camp organization, and Nolan's body was flown all the way to Washington, D.C. specifically, so the exam could be conducted by an examiner with no professional ties to Mississippi law enforcement at all. Crump was blunt about why that mattered to the family. He called it, plainly, a serious trust issue with the official process. Dr. Roger Mitchell, who performed it, isn't just a board-certified forensic pathologist and president of the National Medical Association. He's the former chief medical examiner for Washington, D.C. itself, which is about as credentialed an independent second opinion as a family can realistically get. What he reported was that cause and manner of death were undetermined pending further investigation. The specific finding is worth getting exactly right rather than rounding it up or down to fit a narrative. Red discoloration in the soft tissue at the back of Nolan's head, with no underlying skull fracture and no laceration to the skin over it, meaning whatever caused that discoloration, it wasn't an obvious blunt force blow that broke skin or bone. That's genuinely ambiguous evidence. It's not nothing, and it's not proof of an injury either. Decomposition by that point was severe enough that Mitchell couldn't reliably rule bruising in or out, which is exactly why undetermined was the only honest word available to him. Beyond that one finding, the actual list of open medical questions is longer than most coverage lets on, and now I can tell you exactly why each one is still open rather than just listing them. Mitchell couldn't assess whether Nolan had any neck injury, because portions of the neck and throat had already been retained by the state medical examiner's office by the time his independent exam happened. The state ran its autopsy first, kept certain tissue, and the family's own examiner simply never had access to it. That same gap is why he couldn't examine the airway, lungs, or stomach for any sign of water or anything else. The tissue that would answer those questions wasn't his to look at. No toxicology results were available to him either, which is a timing issue rather than a withheld one. Those results, which typically take 6 to 8 weeks to come back, may still be sitting in a lab right now rather than in anyone's file. Put plainly, in Mitchell's own words, he could not rule out whether any intervening non-accidental factors contributed to or caused the death of Nolan Wells, which is the precise, careful, unglamorous language behind that single word, undetermined. It isn't that nothing was found. It's that the state got there first, kept what it kept, and the second opinion the family paid for was always going to be working with less than the first one had. That's an uncomfortable structural truth about independent autopsies generally, not something specific to Mississippi or to Nolan's case. A family's own examiner almost always arrives second, working with whatever the original examination left behind, which means a second opinion, in a case like this is rarely a fully equal comparison to the first one. It's closer to reviewing someone else's homework after they've already erased half their work. As of the most recent update, on July 31st, the doctor handling that independent examination has specifically been trying to obtain access to those retained tissues from the state, his throat among them, for further study. I don't want to overstate what that request means. It's the ordinary, if frustrating, mechanics of 2 separate medical examinations competing for access to the same limited physical evidence, not evidence of anything hidden or destroyed. But it's part of why undetermined has stayed the operative word this far into the case. The answer may genuinely exist inside tissue the state is holding that the people asking the loudest questions still don't have their hands on. The very next day, July 23rd, District Attorney Angel Myers McElrath's office confirmed the state's own autopsy report would be withheld from the public entirely and sent straight to a grand jury instead. McElrath's stated reasoning being that Mississippi law requires nearly every county death outside natural causes and non-criminal car accidents to go before a grand jury regardless of the circumstances. That's a real, standard piece of Mississippi procedure, not a cover-up by itself. Though I understand exactly why a family already frustrated by weeks of silence would hear, "We're not showing you the results," and feel like the goalposts had moved again. As of July 31st, the most recent update available, the state's official autopsy has been completed and its findings have been sent on to that grand jury, which means the actual forensic answer to how Nolan Wells died may already exist on paper, sitting in a sealed file, known to investigators and unknown to the public, unknown even to his own parents, while the rest of us keep arguing over an interview clip. There is, as of this recording, still no confirmed evidence tampering charge in the Wells case, and I want to flag that plainly because it would be easy, given how tightly these three cases have been bundled by coverage and by Crump himself, to assume the pattern runs 3 for 3. It doesn't, not yet. What exists instead, alongside everything above, is a genuinely messy public fight. Warren Hudson sat for that interview with Brandon Tatum, the conservative commentator and former police officer who flew to Mississippi, spoke with the group of teens, and came away arguing publicly that Crump and Reverend Al Sharpton turned a tragedy into a racial narrative that he says doesn't match what he was personally shown. Tatum has said directly that he had no prior relationship with either Judge Cole or the Hudson family before they reached out to him, pushing back on the assumption that he was handpicked specifically because his politics made him a friendly platform. Take that claim for what it's worth on its own. It doesn't resolve anything about what happened on Horn Island, but it's a fair, specific rebuttal to a specific accusation, and it deserves to be represented here as plainly and fairly as every other claim we've walked through. A second friend, Trace's Tin Shepherd, went viral separately in an unrelated video and had to publicly clarify it was him yelling in that footage, not Nolan, a small, almost throwaway detail that tells you something bigger about how fast and how carelessly footage was being reattached to this case by strangers online within days of Nolan's death. It happened again with a pool photo of Nolan that circulated widely as if it had been taken right before he disappeared, until Hudson had to step in and clarify it was taken on June 27th, a full week before the 4th of July, with his own arm visible around Nolan's shoulder in the frame. Two separate pieces of real footage, both misdated, both spreading before anyone corrected them, which should tell you something about how much of what feels like evidence in a case like this is actually just old content wearing a new, more urgent timestamp. Neither misattribution was malicious in its origin as far as anyone's shown. Footage and photos just get pulled out of context by people scrolling fast, looking for anything that fits the story already forming in their head, and then it spreads faster than any correction ever can. Crump has pushed back on Tatum directly, arguing that Mississippi's specific, documented history means race can't simply be ruled out by assertion, and Sharpton has said publicly that key details in the friends' accounts don't add up to him. Shepard's own account is worth its own space here, because it's more layered than a single viral clip suggests. He's given two separate interviews, one to Good Morning America on July 13th, where he declined to appear on camera at all, citing online threats against him and his friends, and a second, on-camera conversation with Brandon Tatum 2 weeks later. Across both, his story stays consistent on the basics. He spent much of July 4th with Nolan, says Nolan chose to stay behind to spend time with a girl, and says he himself left the island early after getting pulled into an unrelated fight with people who had nothing to do with Nolan at all, at which point he left with his uncle rather than staying for the rest of the day. What he said since carries a weight that's easy to miss under all the noise about who's lying and who isn't. He's described replaying that day constantly, asking himself what would have happened if he hadn't been drinking, if he hadn't gotten pulled into that fight, if he'd stayed longer, if he'd pushed harder to get Nolan on the boat. "I beat myself up every night I lay down," he said. He said the last thing he told Nolan before leaving the island was that he loved him and would see him later. "We did no wrong here," he's also said, and we don't understand how we're getting so much hate behind us. Whatever you make of the rest of his account, it's worth knowing that once Nolan was reported missing, Shepard didn't disappear from the story. He joined the search effort himself, reached out directly to the family, and contributed financially to help them, which at minimum complicates any version of this where he's cast as simply indifferent or self-protective. That's either the voice of someone carrying real, earned guilt over a moment he can't undo, or the voice of someone protecting himself under enormous public pressure. And here's the detail that makes it genuinely hard to know which. Christine Wansley has directly disputed how close Shepard and their son really were, telling one outlet plainly that she and Elmore had never met him, and that calling him a best friend or childhood friend was, in her words, a bit of a stretch, while also being careful, to her credit, not to dismiss his account of that day outright. That's a more measured position than a flat accusation of lying, but it's still not a small disagreement. It means one of the two friends whose accounts this entire public narrative rests on is someone Nolan's own parents say they don't recognize as being especially close to their son at all, which either makes his account less reliable or just reflects how little parents sometimes actually know about which friendships mattered most to their 18-year-old. I genuinely don't know which, and neither, as far as the public record shows, does anyone else outside that friend group. Now here's the part that undercuts both of their accounts at once, and it's the single most important contradiction in this entire case that almost nobody has sat with long enough. The girl herself, 19-year-old Katie McCormick, the one both Hudson and Shepard say Nolan stayed behind for, has never spoken publicly. But her sister, Gracie McCormick, has, and what she's described doesn't match the "he chose to stay with Katie" story at all. According to Gracie, Katie's own understanding was that Nolan was getting ready to get back on the boat with the friends he'd arrived with, and that, as far as Katie knew, he actually did make it back to that boat safely before her own parents picked her up from the island. Gracie has directly disputed the claim that Wells intentionally stayed behind to keep talking with her sister. Sit with what that means. If Katie's own account, relayed through her sister, is accurate, then the central detail both of Nolan's friends gave reporters, that he made a choice to stay on the island with a girl, isn't just unconfirmed. It's actively contradicted by the one other named person who was supposedly part of that decision. I want to be careful here too. This is coming through Katie's sister, not Katie herself, who has stayed out of the public conversation entirely, which is its own kind of restraint worth respecting given everything Warren Hudson and Bart Edmiston have been put through for talking. But if her family's account holds up, it means the entire stayed behind willingly framework, the one Brandon Tatum built his whole segment around, the one that's shaped most of the public sympathy running against Nolan's parents, maybe resting on a detail that the one other witness to it doesn't support at all. Notice, too, who's actually gone on camera in this story and who hasn't, because it isn't random. Warren Hudson, Traces Tin Shepard, Bart Edmiston, the young men, have all sat for interviews, issued statements, given their names to reporters, and all three have absorbed serious, sometimes dangerous backlash for it. Katie McCormick, the one person whose account might actually settle the central question of that afternoon, hasn't said a word publicly. I don't know her reasons, and I'm not going to guess at them for you. But it's worth noticing that the most consequential potential witness in the entire Wells case is also the only central figure who's chosen total silence, and that whatever she knows is currently reaching the public only secondhand, filtered through a sister, exactly the kind of once-removed account that this whole video has been asking you to treat carefully everywhere else it shows up. Think, too, about what it's actually like to be inside that friend group right now, watching each other navigate this in real time. Hudson watched Shepard get interviewed. Shepard watched Hudson get interviewed. Both of them watched Edmiston get accused of murder over a mumbled syllable despite having nothing to do with any of it. Every one of them is making individual, high-stakes decisions, talk or stay silent, hire a lawyer or don't sit for Tatum or decline, inside a group of people who were, 3 weeks earlier, just a normal circle of friends spending a holiday weekend together. There's no version of this where any of them gets to go back to being anonymous 18 to 21-year-olds. Whatever comes out of the grand jury, whatever the tied question resolves to, whatever Katie McCormick eventually decides to say or not say, that specific loss, the ordinary, unremarkable privacy of being young and unknown, is already gone for all of them, permanently, regardless of what any court ever decides. If that's the version of this story you already know, I'd ask you to sit with everything you just heard about the 7-hour gap, the missing Snapchat data, and the distress call audio review, none of which has anything to do with who's right about race, and all of which is simply, factually, still open regardless of which side of that argument you land on. I think both sides of that fight deserve to be represented honestly instead of picked apart to make one of them look worse, because I don't think either one is arguing in bad faith, even where I think one of them is reasoning from thinner evidence than they're presenting it with. Tatum's actual position isn't "nothing suspicious happened." It's narrower than that he personally reviewed what was available to him, spoke with the boys directly, and came away believing the specific claim that race drove what happened to Nolan isn't supported by what he saw, and that turning an unresolved death into a race story, in his view, does its own kind of harm, both to the actual search for what happened and to the young men now living under threat because of it. That's a coherent position, even if you disagree with his conclusion. Crump's position isn't Tatum is lying. It's that Mississippi's own documented history means a family doesn't have to prove race was a factor before it's reasonable to refuse to rule it out this early, before the state's own findings have even been made public. That's also coherent. What isn't coherent, and what neither man actually said, is the version that's metastasized online, where this becomes a referendum on which commentator is the real villain, rather than a shared, unresolved question about a specific boy on a specific island. Both Tatum and Crump, in their sharpest public moments, have made claims that go further than what's actually been confirmed. That's not unique to either of them. It's what happens to almost everyone who spends enough time talking about a case this raw in front of a camera, including, honestly, anyone doing a video like this one, which is exactly why the confirmed versus alleged line matters, more than which side of the argument feels more satisfying to agree with. And here's the human cost sitting underneath all of it, running in two directions at once, that gets almost no airtime compared to the shouting match. Warren Hudson's father, Ben Hudson, has said his family has received thousands of death threats over the past several weeks. He's accused Crump directly of slandering his son and his son's friends, and has said he intends to pursue a defamation claim, though as of this recording, that claim exists as a public accusation and a stated intention, not a filed lawsuit, a distinction worth holding on to exactly, like every other unresolved claim in this story. Warren himself skipped Nolan's funeral on July 20th and gave two reasons when asked about it directly. He said he didn't want his presence to become a distraction from Nolan and his grieving family on the day meant to belong entirely to them, and he said, separately, that he was afraid, for himself and for his family, of what might happen if he showed up in person to a public gathering that size, given everything already aimed at him online. Whatever you think of his account of Horn Island, that's a genuinely bleak position for an 18-year-old to be in 3 weeks after agreeing to an interview, unable to attend the funeral of someone he says was his best friend, not because he was barred from it, but because showing up felt dangerous. I want to be clear about what that allegation is and isn't. It's a real, on-record claim from a named parent that his 18-year-old son, who has not been charged with anything, is being targeted at a scale large enough that his father is counting it in the thousands. It is not proof Crump did anything wrong. A threatened lawsuit is an allegation, same as everything else in the story, and it gets the same label: alleged, not proven. It's not the only harassment thread, and it doesn't cancel out the other one. Christine Wansley works as a family nurse practitioner, and in the weeks since her son's death, her professional page has reportedly been hit with a coordinated wave of one-star reviews, and she said she received hate mail at her home in the days leading up to Nolan's funeral. Warren Hudson's stepmother is Ashley Cole, a sitting Jackson County Chancery judge, and within days of Nolan's death, she posted her own public statement trying to get ahead of the rumors, saying Warren had last seen Nolan around 3 that Saturday afternoon and that the boat left around 4:30 after taking on water, a private family statement that instantly became public evidence the moment a judge's name was attached to it. By July 9th, she was saying publicly that she'd started receiving death threats of her own, which tells you something about how quickly this case stopped being contained to the people directly involved and started pulling in anyone even adjacent to them, elected office or not. That's not an abstract fear either. A 27-year-old man out of California, Joseph Alfredo Vasquez Dumars, allegedly sent Cole Facebook messages threatening to mail a bomb to her office, writing that it would blow you away when you see it, that once the package was opened she'd have maybe 10 seconds or less to ask God for forgiveness, and referencing, chillingly, so much blood everywhere, hard to clean, especially from a boat. He also called her court's office directly. He's now facing a federal charge for threatening to injure another person. That is not a case of a family simply feeling unsafe online. That's a specific, graphic, federal threat against a sitting judge who did nothing more than post a statement about what her stepson had told her. And on July 20th, Crump's own legal team sent Judge Cole a formal evidence preservation letter of her own, the same kind of letter we just walked through, warning that litigation is reasonably anticipated and that she, her family, and anyone under her control need to preserve everything from text messages to location data to social media content, on the record that she faces no accusations herself. That's worth sitting with for a second. A judge who has been accused of nothing, connected to this case only because her stepson was one of the last people with Nolan, is now formally on notice from the family's own legal team, at the same time her family is fielding death threats from strangers. Both of those things are happening to the same household simultaneously. And then there's Bart Edmiston Jr., whose story might be the single strangest, most avoidable piece of harm in this entire case. He's 21, a former Ocean Springs high school teammate of Nolan's, now a punter at the University of Wyoming, and he's the same 21-year-old boat owner who came out and helped the sinking boat get back to shore that afternoon. That's it. That's his actual role in this story. He showed up and helped. Somewhere online, someone claimed to hear the name Bart in garbled audio from the sea-tow call, and from that single mistaken syllable, an influencer with more than 200,000 followers, Kim Brawley, built an entire fabricated narrative that Edmiston was secretly involved with a girl named Katie McCormick who'd been with Nolan on the island, that he'd killed Nolan out of jealousy, that he was, in her words, one of 3 suspects. None of it was true. Edmiston's attorney has said plainly that the photo circulating as supposed proof doesn't even show McCormick, and that Edmiston didn't know who she was before any of this happened. Lee didn't stop at the accusation. She published Edmiston's home address and photos of where he lives to over 200,000 people based on a mistranscribed word in a phone call. He got a credible death threat out of it. His attorney sent a cease and desist on July 29th as the first step toward an actual defamation suit, and has said he's hiring a private investigator specifically to identify everyone else who spread the same false claim, saying, "We will address the falsehoods being presented methodically." Lee's response tells you almost everything you need to know about the incentives running underneath this entire ecosystem. Rather than apologize or take anything down, she treated the legal threat as a promotional opportunity, saying openly that a lawsuit would only raise her profile and that she had attorneys lined up to represent her for free if it came to that. There's an irony sitting right underneath that response worth naming. Lee herself holds a law degree and an advanced legal degree on top of it, which means whatever she decides the risk is worth, it isn't a risk she's taking out of ignorance of what defamation actually is. No apology has followed. No retraction has followed. The false claim, as of this recording, is still up. Sit with the full arc of that. A young man who came out on his own boat to help strangers stuck in a sinking vessel ended up, weeks later, needing a lawyer and a private investigator because the internet decided a mumbled word on a recording was worth more than the actual, documented fact of what he did that day, a fact that existed on paper, in a boat captain's own dispatch log, before any of the rumors ever started. So you don't have one family under siege and one family attacking them. You have at least 4 separate households, the Wansleys, the Hudsons, and Cole, and now a young man who is, if anything, the one person that afternoon who actually helped, absorbing real, documented harassment, while the actual sealed autopsy findings that might settle at least part of this sit in a folder waiting for a grand jury that hasn't convened yet. I think it's worth being honest here about the role people watching from home have played in getting this case to that point. Nobody sent Ben Hudson's family a death threat by accident. Nobody left Christine Wansley a 1-star review because they misunderstood the facts. Those were choices made by real people who watched an interview clip or read a headline and decided the appropriate response to a teenager's unresolved death was to go find someone to punish immediately before any grand jury, any autopsy, any actual finding existed to punish them for. That impulse doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from exactly the discomfort we already talked about, the gap between wanting an answer and not having one. Except instead of sitting with that discomfort, thousands of people decided to manufacture a target instead. It's not only the friends who've absorbed that judgment either. Christine and Elmore Wansley themselves became targets of open commentary and criticism online almost immediately, enough that multiple black press outlets ran op-eds in mid-July specifically arguing that these parents deserved support rather than scrutiny, that grieving publicly, imperfectly, under a camera is not the same thing as grieving wrongly. Watching this case closely doesn't require judging anyone in it before the facts are in. It shouldn't. Even elected officials with a direct stake in calming things down have said as much. Mississippi State Representative Jeffrey Hulum has publicly cautioned against directing threats at officials connected to the case, while being just as direct that the evidence gathered so far doesn't support declaring this a murder any more than it supports declaring it a simple drowning. That's about as close to the center as anyone credible has landed on this case, and it's a useful place to plant your own feet too, at least until that grand jury file stops being sealed. Not every official has stayed that measured, though, and it's worth including the one who didn't, because it shows how far up the chain this case's temperature has actually traveled. Mississippi's own governor, Tate Reeves, publicly blamed Crump and Sharpton directly for the threats swirling around the case, saying they are stoking division for personal gain. It's sad to see, and separately accused Crump of lying about the facts. That's a sitting governor, not an anonymous commenter, weighing in on an active, unresolved death investigation to assign blame for threats that Mississippi's own Department of Public Safety says the FBI is investigating as directed at multiple people, public officials, potential witnesses, and the friends who were with Nolan before he disappeared, and Wells's own family too. Commissioner Sean Tindall, who confirmed the FBI's involvement publicly, put the actual cause more specifically than the governor did. He traced the hostility back to false information circulating online, telling reporters it had generated enough anger that his own office had started fielding threatening phone calls. It's also worth noting where investigators themselves, as opposed to either political figure, currently stand. Their working position, as of the most recent official statements, is that Wells may have drowned and that no evidence of foul play has been found, a notably more settled-sounding position than the family's own independent pathologist has been willing to take. Mississippi's Attorney General, Lynn Fitch, added her own warning on top of the governor's, though hers was aimed at protecting the process rather than assigning blame for it. Efforts to intimidate, disrupt, or interfere with the work of our law enforcement and prosecutors and threats to their well-being will be taken seriously, and we will hold those who make them accountable. Between the governor, the Attorney General, the Public Safety Commissioner, and the FBI, this is no longer a story being fought out only between a family's attorney and a friend group's spokespeople. It's now formally a matter of state. And one clarification worth stating plainly, because Reeves's own accusation didn't include it, authorities have not publicly linked either Crump or Sharpton to any of the actual threats being investigated. The governor accused them of stoking the atmosphere that produced the threats, which is a different, softer claim than accusing them of making or directing any threat themselves, and the difference between those two claims matters exactly as much as every other confirmed versus alleged distinction this video has asked you to track. Crump's response leaned on the same discipline this video keeps asking of you. He pointed to on-record comments from Todd Terrell, president of the United Cajun Navy, who told Nancy Grace that Nolan's body was recovered face down and fully clothed on the beach, a specific, checkable physical detail, offered in response to a governor's accusation, rather than a rhetorical counterpunch. This has never been about casting aspersions or attacking anyone, Crump said. Whatever you make of either side of that specific fight, the fact that a state's governor and a family civil attorney are now publicly trading accusations about an unresolved teenager's death tells you plainly how far outside any courtroom this case has already traveled. There's a pattern worth naming across all three cases, now that you've seen enough of each to spot it yourself. The professionals in this story keep behaving one way, and the amateurs keep behaving another. Dr. Mitchell, examining Nolan with a fraction of the tissue he needed, still landed on the careful, unsatisfying word undetermined, rather than reaching for something more dramatic. Robert Fried, Listening to the same distorted audio TMZ claimed held a confession, said plainly that he couldn't corroborate it, even while admitting his own ears wanted to hear it too. The ballistics examiner in Lexington reported a mismatch, without speculating about what it meant beyond the mismatch itself. Meanwhile, the amateurs, a TikTok transcriber, an influencer with a platform to grow, a stranger threatening a judge over a Facebook post, have been the ones supplying certainty, motive, and villains, none of it verified, most of it wrong when anyone with actual training checked. That's not a coincidence, and it's not really about credentials for their own sake. It's about what each side has to lose from being wrong. A pathologist's name is attached to a finding that can be challenged in court for the rest of his career. An anonymous commenter risks nothing at all for being confidently, catastrophically incorrect about a stranger's life. Nolan's funeral itself, on July 20th at Centerpoint Church in Ocean Springs, is worth pausing on for a moment because it's where several of these threads actually surfaced publicly for the first time, out of Sharpton's own mouth rather than through leaks or unnamed sources. He didn't stay in the register of remembrance for long. For an 18-year-old young man to no longer be with us, we want answers, not bias either way. Just answers, he told the room, and then went further than almost any other public figure attached to this case has gone on the record. He asked, out loud at a funeral, why Nolan's phone and keys had ended up with his friends rather than with him. He asked why nobody had called police the moment they realized he was missing. It could be the healing or the poking of the wound that's going to be decided by what we do, he said, before announcing his own $50,000 contribution to the reward fund. I want to be careful with the phone and keys detail specifically, because it's Sharpton's characterization from a eulogy, not a line from a police report, and it deserves the same, still needs independent confirmation treatment as everything else in this case that hasn't been through a courtroom yet. But if it's accurate, it's hard to explain away. Why would a phone and a set of keys end up separated from the person who owned them, on an island, hours before anyone realized he was gone? There's something almost unbearable about the setting Sharpton chose to raise it in, worth sitting with for just a moment before we move past it. A funeral is supposed to be the one place grief gets to exist, without an audience demanding answers alongside it. Sharpton made a deliberate choice to use that space differently, to turn a room full of mourners into the first public audience for an unresolved investigative question. You can read that as strategic, using the moment's emotional weight to force the case back into headlines it might otherwise have started slipping out of. You can also read it as exactly the kind of urgency a family desperate for answers would want from the person eulogizing their son. Both readings are probably true at once, and neither one changes whether the phone and keys claim itself turns out to be accurate. It's worth noticing, too, how different in scale Nolan's send-off was from the other two. His funeral drew a sitting civil rights icon delivering the eulogy, a $100,000 reward pledge inside the service itself, national reporters, and a wave of coverage that hadn't touched Daniel Erving's or Tyler Smith's memorials at all. That's not a criticism of anyone involved. Nolan's family didn't choose the scale of that attention. Crump's involvement pulled it in whether they wanted the spotlight or not. But it does mean the three families entered this same fight from very different starting positions. The Wansleys had a national platform handed to them almost immediately. The Ervings and the Smiths built theirs slowly, out of local advocacy groups and GoFundMe pages, and a neighbor who drove over in person to deliver the worst news of someone's life, long before any of them ever stood at a podium in Nashville. There's a reward now attached to all of this too, and it's grown fast enough to be its own small story. Tyler Perry matched Sharpton's $50,000 the same day. Former NFL receiver Terrell Owens added another $25,000 the following week, and by the most recent count, additional contributions have pushed the total to $175,000. That kind of public bounty does two things at once, and it's worth naming both honestly. It can genuinely surface a witness who'd otherwise stay quiet. It can also, in a case already flooded with amateur online sleuthing, incentivize exactly the kind of unreliable tips and manufactured evidence that make an already fragile investigation harder to run cleanly. Both of those are true simultaneously, and neither cancels the other out. It's worth putting that number next to the others we've already covered, too. $175,000 for information in Nolan's case, $18,000 for Tyler's funeral, an undisclosed amount for Daniel's, raised by a single mother asking strangers for help she shouldn't have needed to ask for. None of those figures measure how much any of these three young men mattered. They measure something closer to how much national attention each case managed to attract, which turned out to have very little to do with the actual facts of what happened to each of them. Lay all three cases side by side now, and look at the actual shape of it, because this is the part that actually matters more than any single detail on its own. In Dallas, a business owner's own camera catching two boys running from a lake they'd entered with three, a confessed disposal of a body's belongings, a phone thrown into a ditch, a car driven away from the scene, an indicted tampering charge now headed toward trial, and a still unresolved question of whether the drowning itself gets reinvestigated as something more than an accident. In Lexington, a residue test that was never run, a man who admits taking his own gun from a death scene without telling anyone, a recovered firearm that failed to match its own shell casing, a tampering charge against a named 20-year-old the victim's own family says they don't know, and no public answer yet on who fired the shot or where the real weapon is. In Mississippi, no tampering charge at all, but a 7-hour gap between boat leaves the island and someone calls for help, a phone with no Snapchat record from the day that mattered most, phone and keys that somehow ended up with friends rather than their owner, a sinking boat distress call now under forensic audio review, an unresolved question about how a body stayed in place against 2 days of moving tide. A completed state autopsy sealed for a grand jury nobody outside that room has seen, and at least 4 separate households absorbing real harassment from a fight most of them never chose to be part of, including a young man whose only actual role that day was showing up to help. There's a pattern underneath those 3 lists that's easy to miss when you're taking them one at a time, and it isn't about race or motive at all, it's about time, the single resource none of these 3 families have ever had enough of. In Dallas, police had Roper's own account within days of the body surfacing and didn't file an arrest warrant for roughly 2.5 months. In Lexington, a residue test that would have settled the self-inflicted question either way simply never got run. Full stop. At the moment, it would have mattered most. In Mississippi, 60 witnesses got interviewed and the FBI got involved fast, but the one document that might actually answer the central question, the state's own autopsy, has been sitting sealed since July 31st, waiting on a grand jury with no announced date. 3 different flavors of the same underlying problem. Not necessarily indifference, not necessarily conspiracy, but investigations that moved at an institutional pace while 3 families experienced that same pace as agony. That gap between institutional time and a grieving family's sense of time is, more than any single fact in any single case, the actual engine driving all of this into the public eye the way it has. Even the way each family first learned something was wrong follows that same pattern of official channels arriving late. Tamika Erving found out through a missing persons report she filed herself, after her son didn't come home from what he'd told her was a fishing trip. Christine Wansley found out through a chain of phone calls that started with Warren Hudson at 11 at night, not through any official notification. Nacy Anderson's family found out because a concerned neighbor drove over in person, ahead of any call from police or a chaplain. In all 3 cases, the first real information reached the people who loved these young men through informal channels, a friend, a neighbor, a mother's own persistence, before any institution built to handle exactly this moment managed to get there first. That's not a coincidence repeating itself 3 times. It's the same structural gap showing up at the very beginning of each story instead of just in the investigations that followed. It's also worth noticing how differently these 3 women have carried the public-facing part of this, because it says something about the specific shape each family's grief has been forced to take. Christine Wansley has spoken constantly on national television at a funeral covered by outlets across the country, her exhaustion and her composure both visible in real time to millions of strangers. Tamika Erving has stayed closer to home, speaking mostly at local press conferences alongside community organizers who'd already been fighting for her son for months before any national attorney arrived. Nacy Anderson has spoken the least publicly of the 3, her fight conducted mostly through a handful of pointed interviews and a grandson's memory she guards carefully in her own words rather than anyone else's. None of those postures is more correct than the others. They're just 3 different answers to the same impossible question. How do you grieve a child in public when the public won't leave you alone long enough to grieve in private? And the scale of national attention any of them received had almost nothing to do with which family needed support the most. Before we get into that, I want to go back to something I raised near the start, because I don't think one paragraph did it justice, and it's worth actually sitting with rather than rushing past on the way to the legal explainer. There's a specific kind of pull a story like this one exerts, and it isn't morbid curiosity, or at least it isn't only that. Part of what's happening, I think, is that an unresolved case gives your mind something a resolved one doesn't. An open question it can keep returning to, testing new information against, revising in real time. That's not a flaw in how people process this kind of story. It's close to how attention actually works. We're wired to keep circling back to something unfinished far more than something settled, which is exactly why undetermined produces more engagement, more theorizing, more raw hours of attention than a clean verdict ever would. None of that is a criticism of you for watching this, or of me for making it. It's just worth naming honestly because it explains something about why these three cases specifically have outrun the pace of the actual investigations behind them. Here's the part of that dynamic that actually causes harm, though, and it's specific enough to name precisely. An open question invites a guess, and a guess, repeated enough times by enough people with enough confidence, starts to feel like knowledge. That's how a mistranscribed syllable in a phone call turned into a fabricated affair, a fabricated motive, and a credible death threat against a man whose actual, entire connection to this case was showing up to help. That's how a photo from June 27th got treated as proof of something that happened on July 4th. Somewhere in the last several weeks, for a meaningful number of people following this story, the discomfort of not knowing got resolved not by an actual answer, but by picking one and defending it as if it had already arrived. I'd rather you leave this video still holding the discomfort than have resolved it falsely, because false resolution is worse than no resolution. It doesn't just fail to help these three families, it actively adds to what they're carrying. If you want a practical way to hold that discomfort without it curdling into the kind of certainty that gets innocent people death threats, here's the method this entire video has been built on, laid out plainly instead of just demonstrated piece by piece. First, ask where a claim actually comes from. An affidavit, a coroner's report, and a courtroom filing sit on entirely different ground than a tweet, a TikTok transcription, or sources say. Second, ask whether the person making the claim has something to gain or lose from you believing it, not as an automatic disqualifier. Everyone in this story has some stake in how it's told, but as a filter for how much weight to give any single account on its own. Third, and this is the one almost nobody does, ask what a claim would require to be true and whether anyone's checked that requirement. A mismatched shell casing is checkable. A feeling that someone's story doesn't add up isn't, not on its own. Run Katie McCormick's account through that method, and you get something specific and cautious. Secondhand, through a sister, but grounded in an actual claim about actual events, worth taking seriously and worth holding loosely at the same time. Run the TMZ audio through it, and you get the opposite. A claim from an anonymous transcription process, contradicted by an independent expert, that should never have spread as far as it did. Run Chestnut's own account through it too, since it's the one piece of this whole story that comes with a built-in test. He says he handed his gun to Smith, and Smith allegedly used it on himself. That claim isn't secondhand, and it isn't anonymous. It's a direct statement to police from the one person who admits being close enough to matter. But it also comes from someone facing a felony charge over what happened next, which gives him a real, specific reason to shape his account in his own favor, and it runs directly against a piece of physical evidence, the mismatched shell casing, that doesn't care what anyone wants to be true. That's the whole method in miniature. A direct, on-record claim from an interested source, contradicted by physical evidence that can't be talked out of what it shows. Treated accordingly, not dismissed, not accepted, held exactly as carefully as everything else in this story that hasn't been through a courtroom yet. That's not a complicated system. It's just slower than scrolling and slower than picking a side, which is exactly why almost nobody does it under time pressure, and exactly why doing it anyway is the whole point of a video like this one. I'd be leaving something out if I didn't acknowledge the incentive sitting on my own side of the camera too, because it's the same one driving everything else in this story. A video that says, "Here's a confirmed confession," gets watched all the way through in a way a video that says, appears an unresolved gap in the timeline often doesn't. Certainty is more clickable than caution. In true crime and everywhere else, content competes for attention, and that pressure doesn't disappear just because a creator is being careful about sourcing. It shapes which stories get covered at all, how fast and how confidently. I'm not exempt from that pressure by pointing it out. What I can do is tell you plainly that this video runs slower and hedges more than the version of it that would probably perform better, and let you decide what that's worth to you. So, why does any of this matter beyond the private grief of 3 households? Because in every interview Crump has given about all 3 cases, he keeps describing a set of legal tools that almost nobody actually explains, and understanding them is the difference between watching this as a spectacle and understanding what's happening procedurally right now behind the headlines. Here's the part almost nobody sits down and explains, and it matters more than it sounds like it should. A family attorney, no matter how well-known, doesn't have police power. He can't knock on a phone company's door and demand records the way a detective can. He can't make anyone hand over anything. So before any of these families can even think about a lawsuit, there's a much quieter first step: legally becoming the person allowed to speak for their son now that he's gone. That sounds obvious. Of course, a mother can act on her child's behalf, but the law doesn't actually work that way. Grief doesn't come with legal standing attached to it. A parent has to go through the courts and formally be recognized as the one who can act for their child's affairs after death, and only once that happens do they gain the power to go after records, phone data, social media accounts, whatever a towing company might have on file. That's the door Crump has described walking through in Nolan's case, not to settle anyone's affairs, but because it's the only door that lets a family start asking, with legal weight behind the question, for things to be preserved before investigators get around to asking at all. This isn't theoretical in the Wells case, either. The family has already issued subpoenas to social media companies and sent preservation letters tied to an anticipated civil lawsuit, which means everything described here isn't a hypothetical explanation of how the process could work. It's a description of steps that have already been taken. A 10-page notice from the firm Carroll Bufkin, PLLC, went out to Warren Hudson, Ashley Cole, and their families demanding preservation of text messages, emails, photos, videos, social media accounts, and boat records, essentially the opening move of anticipated civil litigation. The date it went out is worth sitting with on its own: July 20th, the same day the family buried Nolan. Whatever legal logic justified that timing, and there likely was some, funerals draw people together, letters need to reach everyone at once. Receiving formal litigation paperwork on the same day you're standing at your best friend's funeral is its own particular kind of collision. One more example of how little room this case is left for anyone involved to simply grieve without a legal or public dimension attached to it. That's the exact kind of legal instruction that would have mattered most in Daniel Erving's case, sent months too late to matter there, sent early enough here that it might actually work. Crump, after meeting with District Attorney McElrath on July 15th, was blunt about what he wants from her office specifically. A thorough investigation must be completed, and the district attorney must put every relevant fact before the grand jury. Nothing held back. Nothing overlooked. Compare that to Daniel Erving's family, still waiting for any equivalent letter to reach anyone connected to that case's actual grand jury presentation, and you can see the practical difference legal resources and a high-profile attorney's involvement actually make. It isn't that the Erving or Smith families are doing anything wrong or moving less urgently. It's that the machinery available to a family able to attract a nationally known civil rights attorney within days of a death looks structurally different from the machinery available to a family building that same fight from a GoFundMe page and a local advocacy group. That gap is real. It's measurable in actual legal filings, and it has nothing to do with whose son mattered more. And once that door is open, there's a second, simpler move: a formal letter sent to anyone who might be holding something relevant, telling them plainly that legal action is expected and that whatever they're holding needs to stay exactly as it is, untouched, undelete. It's not a threat dressed up in nice language. It's a real warning with real teeth. If that evidence disappears after the letter arrives, whoever deleted it is now in a different kind of trouble than they were the day before. In a civil lawsuit down the road, a judge who finds that someone destroyed evidence after being formally warned can punish that person specifically for the destruction, separate from whatever the underlying case decides. sometimes by telling a jury they're allowed to assume the missing evidence would have hurt the person who deleted it, sometimes by throwing out that person's defense entirely on the point the evidence would have covered. That's a real, serious consequence, and it's exactly why a letter like this changes someone's incentives the moment it lands in their inbox, whether or not they ever intended to delete anything in the first place. That's why these letters go out early, weeks before anyone's actually suing anybody, because by the time an investigation gets around to asking the right questions, the answer might already be gone, the way it very nearly was in Daniel Erving's case, where a phone got wiped clean before anyone official ever thought to ask for it. Sit with what that actually says underneath the legal language. In a system working the way it's supposed to, no grieving parent should need their own private playbook just to keep evidence from quietly vanishing while everyone waits for official channels to catch up. The fact that this workaround exists at all, and that families keep reaching for it independently of each other, isn't proof that any one detective or prosecutor did something wrong. It's just a quiet, honest signal about how much these families feel they can't afford to wait. None of that proves what happened to Nolan Wells. None of it resolves how Tyler Smith died. None of it turns Daniel Erving's drowning into a proven murder. What it does is explain something that's been sitting in plain sight in every one of Crump's interviews without anyone translating it. He isn't, at this stage, building a criminal case. He can't. He doesn't have that power, and it isn't his job. He's building a preservation record and public pressure using the only legal tools a private family attorney actually has, so that if and when prosecutors do move, or don't move fast enough, the evidence and the public record haven't already evaporated the way Erving's message history nearly did before Roper was ever caught, or the way Nolan's Snapchat history already may have. If you've made it this far, that's exactly the kind of attention this story needs and almost never gets. So go ahead and hit subscribe now, because we're going to keep tracking all three of these cases as the actual paperwork develops, not just as the headlines shift, and the sealed grand jury filing alone is worth staying for. There's a reason families like the Wansleys, the Ervings, and Tyler Smith's relatives reach for an independent attorney and an independent autopsy before waiting on the state to finish its own process. And it isn't paranoia manufactured for a camera. It's a pattern with real, checkable weight behind it, and I think it's worth grounding specifically rather than gesturing at vaguely the way a lot of commentary on this does. In 1963, civil rights leader Medgar Evers was assassinated in Jackson, Mississippi. His killer, Byron DeLaw Beckwith, was tried twice in 1964, both trials ending in hung, all-white juries, and it wasn't until 1994, 31 years after the murder, on a third prosecution, that Beckwith was finally convicted. That's documented judicial history, not folklore, about how long a Mississippi court can take to resolve even a case with strong evidence when the victim is black. More recently, and entirely separately, an investigation surfaced in Hinds County, Mississippi, the same county that includes Jackson, revealing that the county coroner's office had, since 2016, buried more than 200 people in an unmarked pauper's field behind the old penal farm, without notifying their families, in some cases for years. Families searching for missing relatives learned only later, sometimes from reporters rather than from the county itself, that their loved ones had already been buried in unmarked graves identified only by metal rods and numbers. 3 of those cases became national news in their own right: Dexter Wade, Mario Moore, Jonathan David Hankins, 3 men whose own families spent months not knowing where they were, only to learn the county had known the whole time and simply never called. Crump represented those families too, along with clergy in Jackson, and called for a federal investigation once that practice came to light. And there's an older, harder Mississippi story underneath all of this, the same one, in fact, that Nacy Anderson reached for on her own, 3 states away, when she was trying to explain what it felt like watching Tyler's case get waved off. "The first thing that came to mind for me," she said, "was the story of Emmett Till and how disregarded his mother must have felt." She wasn't talking about Mississippi specifically. Tyler died in Kentucky. She was talking about a feeling, a specific, generational kind of disregard that a grandmother in 2026 reached for a 1955 case to describe, because apparently nothing more recent captured it as precisely. It's worth actually knowing that story rather than just gesturing at it. In 1955, a 14-year-old named Emmett Till was murdered in Money, Mississippi. His body recovered from the Tallahatchie River days later. The men tried for his killing were acquitted by an all-white jury in roughly an hour, and it would take until the following decades, long after both men had died, for the case to be reopened at all in any serious way. That history isn't invoked lightly, and I don't think it should be. Nolan's case and Emmett Till's case are not the same case, separated by 70 years, entirely different circumstances, and it would be dishonest to flatten them into one story. But it's also not a coincidence that a body recovered from Mississippi water, in a case where the state has chosen to seal its own findings until a grand jury reviews them, sits inside a state with that specific history of what, wait for the system to work, has actually produced before. And it's worth knowing, too, that commissioning an independent, family-funded autopsy the way Nolan's parents did isn't some new tactic invented for this case. Crump has walked families through that exact process before, in Trayvon Martin's case in Sanford, in Michael Brown's case in Ferguson, in George Floyd's case in Minneapolis, in Breonna Taylor's case in Louisville, each time because the family didn't trust that the first official answer would be the only one they'd ever get. Whatever you think of Crump personally, that pattern predates Nolan Wells by close to a decade, which at minimum tells you this isn't a strategy invented on the fly for a camera. NAACP President Derek Johnson framed the underlying principle in a single sentence worth holding onto through the rest of this. The narrative should not be, it was an accident before there was an investigation. That's not a claim that it wasn't an accident. It's an argument about sequence that the label gets applied, and then the digging happens, when for families like this one it's felt like it should run the other way around. None of that proves anything about what happened to Nolan Wells specifically, and I want to be careful not to let it do work it can't actually do. A 1994 murder conviction and a 2016 burial scandal don't tell you what happened on Horn Island in 2026. What that history does is answer a question a lot of the online argument keeps skipping past entirely. Not, was this case handled fairly, which nobody can answer yet, but why wouldn't a family in this specific state, facing an undetermined ruling and a sealed autopsy, default to patience the way people keep telling them to? The honest answer is that patience, in that specific place, has a documented track record of not being rewarded, and a family doesn't need to believe every case is corrupt to reasonably decide they're not willing to bet their son's case on being the exception. There's a cost to that pattern that goes beyond any single family too, and it's worth naming plainly before we move on. Every time an independent, family-funded autopsy becomes the only version of events a grieving parent trusts, that's one more small signal that the official process itself has lost some of its credibility, not just in this case, but as an institution people are willing to rely on by default. That's not a criticism of any individual medical examiner or detective working these three cases in good faith, and plenty of them likely are. It's a broader, slower kind of erosion. The sense that you need your own expert, your own attorney, your own audio engineer, just to get a fair hearing, rather than trusting the process that's supposed to exist for exactly that purpose. Mississippi didn't invent that erosion. It has a documented history that makes it a specific, checkable example of it. But it's a national pattern, not a regional embarrassment, and it shows up any time institutions move slower than the families they're supposed to serve. Rebuilding that kind of trust once it's gone isn't quick or simple either. It takes years of an institution consistently doing the slow, unglamorous work of being right, transparent, and on time, and a single high-profile failure can undo far more of that credibility than a dozen quiet successes can rebuild. That asymmetry is part of why these three cases matter beyond themselves. However they resolve, they're also, whether anyone intends it that way, a test of whether the ordinary process can still earn back the benefit of the doubt it's already lost with families like these. So what actually happens from here, in each of these three cases, without me pretending to know the ending? A grand jury, in plain terms, isn't a trial. It's a private room where a prosecutor lays out evidence, and a panel of ordinary citizens decides whether there's enough to formally charge someone with a crime. No defense attorney present, no cross-examination, just the state's version of events. There's a piece of the tampering charge itself worth understanding too, because it's the exact hinge every defense in all three of these cases will eventually turn on. Tampering isn't just about whether someone moved or destroyed something. Prosecutors also have to prove intent, specifically that the person knew an investigation was coming and acted to impair it, not that they panicked in a way that happened to look similar from the outside. That distinction is Roper's entire likely defense in miniature. He's on record telling police he was afraid of getting in trouble, which sounds damning, but a defense attorney can just as easily frame that same statement as evidence of ordinary fear rather than calculated obstruction. The law draws a real line between a 19-year-old panicking and freezing versus a 19-year-old coolly deciding to defeat an investigation, and proving which side of that line a specific set of actions falls on, months after the fact, from a defendant's own words, is a genuinely harder task than the phrase, tampering with evidence, makes it sound. That's not a defense of what Roper did. It's the actual legal mechanism his case and chestnuts will get tested against. Mississippi's grand jury, once it finally convenes and reviews the sealed Wells autopsy alongside whatever else investigators have gathered, could do any number of things. Decline to indict anyone at all, indict someone specific, or simply let the findings stand as undetermined with no criminal charge attached to the death itself, which is a real, legally available outcome even in a case this publicly scrutinized. If it does move toward a charge, Mississippi's own homicide law rests on something called culpable negligence, a reckless action or failure to act that places someone at an unreasonable, foreseeable risk of death, sitting below murder on the same kind of ladder Texas and Kentucky both have. But that entire pathway depends on a cause of death Mississippi hasn't been willing to name publicly yet, which is exactly why this case is, structurally, the least far along of the three, whatever the volume of public attention around it suggests. In Texas, that first grand jury step has already happened. Roper's tampering indictment came down July 31st, and his case now moves toward arraignment and, eventually, trial on that specific charge, regardless of whether prosecutors ever add anything heavier. Whatever attorney eventually represents him, and none has been publicly identified as of this recording, would likely argue panic rather than premeditation, and try to keep the tampering charge as small and isolated from the drowning itself as possible, precisely because conceding any connection between the two makes the case considerably worse for a client. I'll note plainly, for fairness's sake, that Roper himself has never spoken publicly about any of this. Reporters have tried, including at least one who found him on social media and asked directly for comment, and got nothing back. That silence isn't proof of guilt any more than anyone else's silence in this story would be. It's just the one voice in this entire hour you haven't heard from at all. There's a real, practical cost to how loudly all three of these cases have already played out online, and it's one that could end up working against the very families pushing hardest for accountability. Whenever any of these cases reaches an actual trial, both sides get to question potential jurors about what they've already heard and whether they can set it aside, and a defense attorney in any of these three cases now has a genuinely strong argument that the jury pool has been saturated with the TMZ audio, with the drinking claims, with a governor and a family attorney publicly trading accusations, with a $175,000 reward attached to one of them. Courts can respond to that with more careful jury selection, or in extreme cases by moving a trial to a different county entirely, but neither option is free, and both slow things down further. The same online attention that's kept pressure on investigators to actually move on these cases is also, quietly, building the exact record a defense attorney would want to point to later and say a fair jury simply isn't possible where the case originated. That tension doesn't have a clean resolution. It's just true, and worth knowing before you assume more noise automatically helps the people asking for justice. It's worth being precise, too, about what murder charges, the specific thing the Erving family keeps asking for, would require under Texas law because the phrase gets used loosely and the legal reality underneath it is narrower. Texas has an intermediate charge below murder called criminally negligent homicide. It applies when someone's death results from a person failing to recognize a serious, obvious risk that a reasonable person would have caught, a lower bar than proving someone intended harm or consciously disregarded a known danger, which is closer to what manslaughter requires. None of the public reporting so far suggests prosecutors are building toward a murder charge in the sense of proving Roper intended to kill Erving. What the family's push for a grand jury presentation on the underlying death, not just the tampering, opens the door to is something more like that lower tier, a charge tied to what Roper did or didn't do once Erving was in trouble in the water, not an accusation that he caused the drowning in the first place. That's a real, meaningful legal pathway. It's also a considerably narrower one than murder charges, as a phrase tends to promise, and the gap between those two things is exactly the kind of gap this video keeps asking you to notice rather than paper over. In Kentucky, Chestnut's case turns heavily on what that mismatched firearm actually was and where it came from. If investigators ever recover the weapon Chestnut admits he removed from the scene, ballistics on that weapon becomes the single most important piece of evidence in the entire case, more than any witness account from that night. Kentucky's own version of that lower-tier homicide charge is called reckless homicide, causing a death by failing to perceive a risk that grossly deviates from ordinary care, sitting below manslaughter and murder on the same ladder Texas has. Whether anything like that ever gets filed against anyone in Smith's death depends entirely on a question nobody has publicly answered yet: whose hand was actually on the trigger, and whether that person's actions amount to more than the accident everyone initially assumed. None of these are predictions. They're the realistic range of what's still unresolved tends to look like as a real case moves forward, instead of the tidy ending true crime content usually promises and rarely delivers. It's also worth understanding why families in all three of these cases are pursuing a civil lawsuit at the same time as, not instead of, whatever the criminal side produces, because the two tracks aren't actually competing with each other. A criminal case belongs to the state. A prosecutor decides whether to bring it, and if convicted, the punishment is prison, not money to the family. A civil wrongful death suit belongs to the family directly, requires a lower standard of proof than a criminal conviction does, and can proceed on its own timeline regardless of what a district attorney decides to do or not do. That's why you'll see these families building both tracks simultaneously. The estate filings, the subpoenas, the preservation letters are civil track machinery, running in parallel to whatever a grand jury eventually decides, not dependent on it. A family can lose the criminal fight entirely if a grand jury declines to indict anyone and still win a wrongful death judgment in civil court because the two systems are asking different questions under different rules. That's not a loophole. It's the actual design of the system, and it's exactly what all three of these families are using right now, whether or not the coverage around them ever explains it that plainly. It's worth knowing, briefly, that the actual weight these tampering charges carry isn't identical from state to state, even though the label sounds the same in every headline. In Texas, what Roper and the younger suspect are charged with is a third-degree felony. In Kentucky, what Chestnut is charged with sits one notch lower on the seriousness scale, generally punishable by 1 to 5 years. Mississippi's own tampering statute carries the steepest maximum of the three, up to 10 years, roughly double Texas's exposure and double Kentucky's, which matters only because it's also the one state, of the three, where no such charge has actually been filed yet. That's not a legal technicality I'm including for its own sake. It means that even if the Wells case does eventually produce a tampering charge the way Dallas and Lexington already have, the actual legal stakes attached to it would look different again, in a state with its own separate legal history already covered earlier. One more reason the same thing is happening in all three cases isn't quite as clean a sentence as it sounds. For Nolan's case specifically, forensic pathologists outside the family's own team have said the realistic path forward runs through the state's own examiner, who had access to retained tissue and evidence the independent exam never got, meaning it's the state, not Crump's team, that's actually best positioned to resolve some of what's still unclear, if it chooses to. That process, by outside estimates, could take months rather than weeks. Crump, for his part, has said he wants more than just Mitchell's written findings handed over. He wants Mitchell himself to testify in front of the grand jury directly. We would hope that the district attorney would present Dr. Mitchell before the grand jury as well, he said. We want all relevant information to be heard by the grand jury. Whether that happens is entirely up to a prosecutor's office that, so far, hasn't said much publicly about its own plans. So where does that actually leave all three cases right now, honestly, without pretending we can hand you a conclusion the evidence doesn't support yet? Daniel Erving, an indicted tampering charge headed toward trial, a confessed disposal of his belongings, a phone thrown in a ditch, a business owner's own camera catching two boys running from the water they'd entered with three, and an open question of whether the drowning itself gets reinvestigated as more than an accident. Tyler Smith, a confirmed tampering charge tied to a gun that didn't match its own shell casing, a man who admits removing his own weapon from the scene, a residue test that was never run, and no public resolution of who actually fired the shot or where the real weapon went. Nolan Wells, no tampering charge as of today, an independent autopsy that landed on undetermined rather than anything firmer because the state had already retained key tissue before the family's own examiner ever got access. A completed state autopsy now sealed for a grand jury, a 7-hour gap between the boat leaving and anyone raising an alarm, phone, and keys that ended up with friends rather than their owner. A day of missing digital records that echoes almost exactly what's already been. Charged in Erving's case 3 states away, a sinking boat that apparently unsank itself with no follow-up call, an unexplained title question about where the body was found, 2 friends whose timelines don't fully line up even within their own retelling or with each other, and at least 3 separate households now absorbing real, documented harassment from a fight most of them never chose to enter. Ask yourself the question this whole thing turns on, the one almost none of the coverage sits with long enough to ask out loud. In each of these 3 cases, whose account is the official version actually resting on? And were those people the ones with something to lose if the truth came out differently? In Dallas, the ruling rested on the 2 people who disposed of evidence, until it didn't hold. In Lexington, it rested on witnesses at a party, until a gun that didn't match blew a hole straight through it. In Mississippi, the public version has rested, so far, mostly on 2 friends' account of a chaotic afternoon, and the one other named person who could corroborate the central detail of that account, relayed only through her sister, doesn't actually back it up. Whatever's sitting in that sealed grand jury file may or may not settle any of it. And it's worth knowing exactly how that seal breaks, because sealed doesn't mean sealed forever. Mississippi's grand jury process, once it concludes, typically results in either an indictment becoming public record as a formal charge or a no bill that closes the criminal door without necessarily explaining why. The autopsy findings themselves could still stay confidential even after the grand jury acts, depending on how prosecutors choose to handle it, or they could become part of the public record if charges are filed and the case moves toward trial. That's the actual, mundane mechanism standing between where this case is right now and whatever comes next, not a conspiracy keeping the truth hidden forever, but an ordinary, if frustratingly slow, legal process that hasn't finished its own sequence yet. A no bill, specifically, is often the outcome families find hardest to process because it doesn't come with an explanation attached. Jurors simply decline to indict, the reasoning stays inside that closed room, and a family is left knowing only the outcome, never the why. That's a real, structural gap in how the system communicates its own decisions, and it applies regardless of which way any of these 3 grand juries eventually goes. What ties all 3 together isn't a proven conspiracy, and it isn't, contrary to how it's often framed online, a fully settled story about race and policing, even though the family's concerns about how their cases have been handled deserve to be taken seriously on their own terms, separately from whether every online claim attached to them turns out to be accurate. What ties them together, provably on paper, is this. In at least 2 of the 3, someone who was present when an 18-year-old died made a choice, in the immediate aftermath, to interfere with the record of what happened rather than preserve it. That choice is now the subject of its own separate prosecution, running in parallel to, and sometimes ahead of, any resolution of the deaths themselves. And in the 3rd, a family is watching that same pattern, vanished digital evidence, an unexplained gap in the timeline, play out in their own son's case in real time, without, so far, a single charge attached to it. That's not a smaller story than the one you've probably already heard about these 3 cases. It's a more specific one, and it's the one most coverage has skipped past to get to the louder, more emotionally charged fight over motive that nobody, including the people closest to these families, is actually in a position to settle yet. One last thing before we close this out. Lucas Roper is 19. Bryce Chestnut is 20. Warren Hudson and Traciston Shepard are both 18, same as the boy they're being asked to account for. Bart Edmiston is 21, and his entire role in any of this was showing up in his own boat to help. None of them woke up on those mornings expecting to spend the rest of their lives permanently searchable, their names forever paired in a headline with a word like tampering or friend of. Whatever any of them did or didn't do in the panic of those specific nights, that's a genuinely heavy thing to carry into the rest of a life that, weeks earlier, looked like any other 18, 19, 20-year-olds, school, friends, a summer. That's not an argument for excusing anything. It's just true. This story doesn't only contain 3 families grieving sons. It also contains a handful of very young people who are going to spend years, maybe the rest of their lives, answering for a handful of minutes, and some of them may turn out to deserve that far more than others, and right now, from the outside, there's no way to know for certain which of them is which. Even Katie McCormick belongs on that list in her own way, whether or not she ever says a public word about any of it. 19 years old, at the center of a rumor that got a man death threats, holding whatever she actually knows about that afternoon entirely to herself, watching her own name get attached to a story she hasn't chosen to enter. If you're wondering what counts as real movement in any of these 3 cases, rather than just more noise, here's a short, concrete list to hold on to instead of waiting for a headline to tell you how to feel. In Dallas, whether Roper's arraignment produces any hint of a heavier charge, and whether the recovered surveillance footage ever gets formally entered as evidence. In Lexington, whether that mismatched firearm ever actually surfaces, and whether the residue test that should have happened on July 4th gets run retroactively on anyone still available to test. In Mississippi, whether the sealed autopsy or any part of it becomes public once the grand jury acts, whether the joint phone inspection happens at all, and whether Crump's oceanic tide question ever gets a real scientific answer instead of a rhetorical one. Those are the actual markers. Watch, too, for whether Bart Edmiston's cease and desist ever actually becomes a filed defamation suit, and whether Kimbra Lee's confidence about her legal exposure turns out to be as well-founded as she's acted like it is. Everything else, the reward totals, most of the cease and desists, the governor's statements, the influencer feuds, is texture around the edges of a story whose real center is still sitting in evidence lockers and sealed files, waiting on people whose names you'll probably never learn, doing work that will never trend, in offices that will never make the news. If you want to see where this goes, subscribe and turn on notifications, because we're going to keep following the actual filings on all 3 of these, not just the interviews. And if this kind of breakdown, the part almost nobody else is doing, is useful to you, consider joining the channel membership, because it's what lets us keep digging into the paperwork behind stories like this instead of just repeating whatever gets the most views that week. 3 teenagers. 3 states. 3 families who didn't get to bury their sons quietly. And underneath all the noise and narrower, far more provable questions sitting in front of 3 separate court systems right now. Not who is guilty of taking these young men's lives, because nobody outside those rooms and those investigations actually knows that yet, but who chose, in the minutes and hours after each of them died, to make it harder to find out. That's the case that's actually being built. That's the one worth watching closely. What Tamika Erving, Nacy Anderson, and Christine and Elmore Wansley are asking for, underneath every interview, every press conference, every legal filing, was never a particular verdict. Listen closely to what each of them has directly said, not what's been said about them by everyone else. A plain, reasonable-minded explanation, honestly given. Somebody who mattered, spoken of honestly, and not quietly erased. A fair, honest, thorough investigation, nothing more dramatic or complicated than that. None of them have demanded the internet pick a side, or send anyone death threats, or turn their own sons into symbols before the facts are even fully in. That particular demand came from somewhere else entirely, from all of us, watching from a distance, genuinely uncomfortable with not knowing, reaching for certainty faster than 3 overworked, underfunded court systems can honestly provide it. Think back to everything that turned out to matter across this hour, and notice how little of it came from anyone shouting. It was a business owner's quiet security camera, running the whole time, that ended up saying more than either suspect's own account. It was a residue test nobody thought to run that, in its absence, became the loudest fact in an entire case. It was a sister, speaking carefully on someone else's behalf, undercutting a story too much louder voices had already told. It was a digital forensics expert admitting on the record that his own ears started drifting toward hearing something that wasn't actually there. Every piece of this that held up under pressure was quiet, checkable, and slow to arrive. Almost everything that didn't hold up was loud, immediate, and confident from the first second it appeared. That's not a coincidence, and it's not going to stop being true the next time a case like this one grips the internet's attention, whenever that turns out to be. Somewhere in Dallas right now, a 19-year-old is waiting for an arraignment date he hasn't spoken publicly about. Somewhere in Lexington, a 20-year-old is doing the same, over a gun that still hasn't turned up. Somewhere in Mississippi, a sealed folder is sitting on a desk, waiting for a grand jury with no announced date, holding an answer that Nolan's own parents don't have access to yet. None of those three things are dramatic. None of them will trend. They're just true, ongoing, unglamorous facts about where three real investigations actually stand, underneath every reward announcement and every doctored recording and every governor's press conference this story has produced. That's what accountability actually looks like while it's still in progress. Not a verdict, not a viral moment, just paperwork moving, slowly, through rooms none of us will ever see inside of, carrying the weight of three families who are still, every single day, just waiting to know. The most respectful thing any of us watching from outside these three families can do is what they've each been asking for from the very beginning. In their own words, however it eventually turns out, keep asking the real question, patiently, and stop pretending we already have the answer just because we're tired of not having one. Nolan Wells, Daniel Erving, Tyler Smith. Say their names the way their families want them said, not as a hashtag, not as a symbol borrowed for somebody else's argument, not as a data point in whichever version of this story you'd already quietly decided to believe before you ever pressed play. Three real young men, each with real plans, real families, and unanswered questions attached to checkable facts. A robotics program in Lexington that's still waiting for a student who never showed up. A swim team roster in Satcha with a name that still needs to be crossed off it eventually when someone finally does that unbearable task. A football locker in Ocean Springs that someone, at some point, is still going to have to clean out. Three ordinary lives, interrupted mid-sentence, that the rest of us only met because of how they ended, not because of how they were lived, which is its own quiet unfairness worth sitting with long after this video ends, long after the next headline replaces this one, long after whatever verdict eventually lands in any of these three courtrooms. That's the one we're going to keep coming back to, one filing at a time, until it's finally resolved.